September 11th, 2024, £900, grizzly destroys police patrol car, 2 officers hospitalized. The morning sun crested over the jagged peaks of Glacier National Park at 6:47 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, casting long shadows across the Going to the Sun Road, where officers David Anthony Carter and Luis Miguel Ramirez had begun their patrol shift 37 minutes earlier. The temperature registered 42 degrees Fahrenheit on the dashboard display of their white Ford Police Interceptor utility, unit number 847, as wisps of ground fog drifted between the towering lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that flanked the narrow mountain highway. Officer Carter, 34 years old, married father of twin daughters Emma and Sophie, age 7, had transferred to the National Park Service Law Enforcement Division 18 months prior after serving 8 years with the Kalispell Police Department. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with the confident ease of someone who had navigated these treacherous mountain roads in every conceivable weather condition. Carter stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 195 pounds, with graying brown hair and steel blue eyes that missed nothing in his peripheral vision. His uniform bore the patches and insignia of a federal law enforcement officer, including his gold badge number 2847 and the Glock 22.40 caliber service weapon holstered on his right hip had been fired only twice in the line of duty during his entire career, both times at rabid animals threatening park visitors. His partner, Officer Luis Ramirez, 28 years old, recently engaged to Sarah Elena Vasquez, a pediatric nurse at Kalispell Regional Medical Center, represented the newer generation of park law enforcement officers. Ramirez had completed his training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers in Glencoe, Georgia, graduating second in his class of 43 recruits. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing 178 pounds, with black hair kept in a precise fade cut and warm brown eyes that reflected his compassionate nature, Ramirez had chosen park service over traditional municipal policing specifically because of his love for wilderness and wildlife conservation. His grandfather, Miguel Santos Ramirez, had worked as a seasonal ranger in Yellowstone National Park during the 1960s and 1970s, instilling in young Luis a deep respect for the natural world and the creatures that inhabited it. The 2 officers had been assigned to patrol the remote northwestern sector of Glacier National Park, covering approximately 47 square miles of rugged wilderness that included portions of the Continental Divide, several alpine lakes, and what park biologists considered some of the most active grizzly bear habitat in the lower 48 states. Their route this particular morning would take them along the North Fork Flathead River corridor, past Kintla Lake, through the Bowman Lake area, and ultimately to the remote Quartz Lakes region, where several backpackers had reported unusual bear sign and possible food cache violations during the previous week. At 7:23 a.m., as their patrol vehicle climbed steadily toward the Bowman Lake trailhead parking area, Carter's radio crackled to life with the voice of park dispatcher Margaret Chen, a 26-year veteran of the Park Service who had coordinated emergency responses to everything from heart attacks on hiking trails to avalanche rescues in the backcountry. Unit 847, this is dispatch. We've received a report from campers at site number 14 in the Bowman Lake campground regarding a large bear, possibly a grizzly, that was observed investigating their food storage area around 05:30 hours this morning. Campers are identified as the Morrison family from Seattle, Washington. They report the bear appeared to be an adult male, very large, with distinctive blonde-tipped fur on the shoulders and back. Over. Carter reached for the radio microphone clipped to his duty belt, depressing the transmission button. Dispatch. Unit 847 copies. We're approximately 15 minutes from Bowman Lake Campground. We'll investigate and report findings. Any additional details on the bear's behavior or current location? Over. Unit 847. Campers report the bear spent approximately 20 minutes investigating their campsite, but did not damage any property. Bear was last observed heading northeast toward the lakeshore around 0600 hours. Campground host has been notified and is monitoring the situation. Weather conditions are clear, temperature rising, wind calm. Over. Copy that. Dispatch. Unit 847 en route to Bowman Lake Campground. ETA approximately 0745 hours. Will advise upon arrival and completion of investigation. Over. The Morrison family consisted of Robert Morrison, age 45, a software engineer for Microsoft, his wife Jennifer, age 42, a high school biology teacher, and their 3 children, Michael, age 16, Jessica, age 14, and Timothy, age 11. They had arrived at Bowman Lake Campground 3 days earlier for what was intended to be a 5-day camping vacation, their first extended wilderness experience as a family. Robert Morrison had purchased extensive camping equipment over the preceding months, including a bear-resistant food container, certified bear spray for each family member, and a detailed guidebook on camping safely in grizzly country. The campsite they occupied, designated as Site Number 14, sat approximately 60 yards from the shore of Bowman Lake, separated from the water by a dense stand of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir trees. The site featured a metal fire ring, a wooden picnic table, and a designated area for their Coleman 4-person tent. According to park regulations, all food and scented items were required to be stored in either hard-sided vehicles or certified bear canisters during overnight hours, a rule the Morrison family had scrupulously followed each evening of their stay. At precisely 5:30 a.m. on September 11th, Jennifer Morrison had been awakened by what she later described as heavy breathing and shuffling sounds, coming from the direction of their parked Toyota Highlander, where they had stored their coolers and food supplies. Peering through the tent's mesh window, she observed a massive grizzly bear, easily weighing between 800 and 900 pounds, methodically investigating their vehicle. The bear's fur appeared to be primarily dark brown, with distinctive golden blonde guard hairs across the shoulders and upper back, characteristics consistent with a mature male grizzly bear in prime condition. The bear exhibited behavior patterns that park biologists would later classify as investigative but non-aggressive, meaning the animal was exploring potential food sources but had not yet committed to attempting to access them. For 23 minutes, the grizzly circled the Morrison family's vehicle, occasionally rising on its hind legs to sniff at the windows and door handles, but making no attempt to damage the car or access the interior where food was stored. Robert Morrison, awakened by his wife's urgent whispers, observed the bear through a small gap in the tent's rainfly, noting the animal's enormous size and the powerful musculature visible beneath its thick coat. Both parents made the decision to remain absolutely silent and still within the tent, following the guidance they had received during the mandatory bear safety presentation attended by all campers upon check-in. At approximately 6 a.m., the grizzly bear ceased its investigation of the Morrison campsite and moved in a northeasterly direction toward the shoreline of Bowman Lake, disappearing into the dense timber that bordered the camping area. Robert Morrison waited an additional 30 minutes before emerging from the tent to inspect their vehicle and surrounding campsite for any signs of damage or disturbance, finding none. By 7:45 a.m., Officers Carter and Ramirez had arrived at the Bowman Lake campground and were conducting their interview with the Morrison family. Carter took detailed notes in his field notebook, while Ramirez photographed the campsite and surrounding area, documenting tire tracks, footprints, and any other evidence that might be relevant to determining the bear's size, age, and current location. The bear was absolutely enormous, Robert Morrison explained to the officers, his hands gesticulating to indicate the animal's massive size. I've seen bears in zoos, but nothing prepared me for seeing one of these grizzlies up close in the wild. The head alone must have been the size of a large dog, and when it stood up on its back legs next to our car, I swear it was taller than I am. Jennifer Morrison added, "What struck me was how quietly it moved for such a large animal. If I hadn't been a light sleeper, we might never have known it was there. It seemed very methodical, very deliberate in the way it was investigating everything around our campsite." Carter examined the ground around the Morrison vehicle, identifying several clear paw prints in the soft earth near the driver's side door. Using a standard measuring tape from his equipment kit, he determined the front paw prints measured approximately 6 inches in length and 5 inches in width, while the rear paw prints extended nearly 12 inches from the heel pad to the end of the claws. The depth and clarity of the impressions in the soil indicated an animal of substantial weight, consistent with the Morrison family's description of a very large male grizzly bear. "Based on these tracks and your description," Carter explained to the family, "you encountered what we call a boar, which is an adult male grizzly. The size of these prints and the behavior you described suggests this is likely one of the larger bears in our population, probably somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds. The good news is that the bear showed no aggressive behavior and caused no damage to your property, which indicates it was simply investigating potential food sources and moved on when it determined there was nothing accessible." Ramirez completed his photographic documentation of the scene and conducted a wider search of the surrounding area, looking for additional sign or evidence of the bear's travel route. He located several more paw prints along a game trail that led from the campsite toward the lake shore, as well as fresh bear scat approximately 40 yards northeast of the campsite. The scat contained partially digested berries, vegetation, and what appeared to be remnants of fish scales, indicating the bear had been feeding on the seasonal salmon run in Bowman Lake. "This is actually pretty typical behavior for this time of year," Ramirez explained to the Morrison children who had gathered around to observe the investigation. "Bears are entering what we call hyperphagia, which means they're trying to consume as many calories as possible before winter hibernation. They can eat up to 20,000 calories per day during this period, so they're constantly searching for food sources." After completing their investigation at the Morrison campsite, the officers planned to conduct a broader patrol of the Bowman Lake area to look for additional sign of the large male grizzly and to check on other campers and day hikers who might be in the vicinity. Carter documented the incident in his daily report, noting the approximate time, location, weather conditions, and the bear's behavior patterns for inclusion in the park's wildlife database. At 8:31 a.m., the officers departed the Bowman Lake campground and began driving slowly along the lake access road, scanning the shoreline and surrounding forest for any signs of bear activity. The morning had warmed to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light breeze from the west carried the scent of pine needles and the distant smokiness that characterized early autumn in the northern Rockies. Carter had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot wildlife during his 18 months patrolling Glacier National Park, a skill that combined his natural observational talents with extensive training in animal behavior and habitat preferences. As they drove along the narrow gravel road that paralleled Bowman Lake's northwestern shore, his eyes constantly scanned the tree line, looking for movement, unusual colors, or anything that might indicate the presence of animals. "There," Carter said suddenly, pointing toward a small meadow approximately 200 yards from the road. "Movement in those serviceberry bushes along the edge of the clearing." Ramirez followed his partner's gaze and spotted what appeared to be a large, dark form moving slowly through the dense vegetation. Carter brought their patrol vehicle to a stop and retrieved his binoculars from the equipment console, focusing on the area where they had observed the movement. "It's definitely a bear," Carter confirmed after several seconds of observation. "Large adult, dark coloration with lighter guard hairs on the back and shoulders. Could be our friend from the Morrison campsite." Through the binoculars, Carter observed a massive grizzly bear methodically feeding on the ripe service berries that grew abundantly in the small mountain meadow. The bear's feeding behavior appeared calm and natural, with no indication that the animal was aware of their presence or concerned about the nearby patrol vehicle. The bear would rise on its hind legs to reach berry clusters on higher branches, demonstrating the impressive height and reach that made these animals so formidable. "I'm estimating this bear at close to 900 pounds, Carter observed, continuing to watch through the binoculars. "Look at the width of that skull and the mass through the shoulders. This is definitely a mature male in prime condition." Ramirez documented their observation in his field notes, recording the time, location, weather conditions, and the bear's behavior. Park protocol required detailed documentation of all wildlife encounters, particularly those involving grizzly bears, to maintain accurate population records and behavior data that informed management decisions. The officers observed the bear for approximately 15 minutes, during which time the animal continued feeding without showing any awareness of their presence. The bear's behavior appeared entirely natural and non-threatening, consistent with normal foraging activity during the pre-hibernation feeding period. At 9:07 a.m., Carter started the patrol vehicle and continued their route toward the more remote areas of their patrol sector. The gravel road wound through increasingly dense forest, climbing gradually in elevation as it approached the trailheads that provided access to some of the park's most pristine wilderness areas. "You know," Ramirez said as they drove, "in all the training we received about bear encounters, they never really prepared you for how impressive these animals are when you see them in their natural habitat. That bear we just watched was like seeing a piece of the wilderness itself. Something that's been unchanged for thousands of years." Carter nodded, remembering his own first encounters with grizzly bears during his early months in the Park Service. "It's humbling, isn't it? We like to think we're the dominant species, but out here, in their territory, we're just visitors. That bear could probably flip our vehicle like a toy if it wanted to." The comment would prove to be more prophetic than either officer could have imagined. By 9:45 a.m., they had reached the end of the maintained road system and were beginning their foot patrol of the Quartz Lakes Trail system, where the previous week's reports of bear sign and possible food cache violations had originated. The trail began at an elevation of approximately 4,200 feet and wound through a mixture of old-growth forest and subalpine meadows before reaching the first of 3 pristine mountain lakes. Carter and Ramirez had hiked this particular trail system numerous times during their partnership, both for law enforcement patrols and personal recreation. The trail was considered moderately difficult, with several stream crossings and approximately 1,200 feet of elevation gain over the first 3 miles. During peak bear activity periods, like the current pre-hibernation feeding season, the trail typically saw increased sign and occasional encounters. As they began their hike, both officers carried the standard equipment required for backcountry law enforcement work: their service weapons, bear spray, first aid kits, GPS units, emergency radios, and sufficient food and water for an extended patrol. Carter also carried a camera for documenting any violations or incidents they might encounter. The first mile of trail passed through dense, mixed forest dominated by western red cedar, Douglas fir, and western hemlock. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns, moss, and fallen logs in various stages of decomposition, creating the complex ecosystem that supported a diverse population of wildlife. Bear sign was immediately evident along the trail, including several fresh scat deposits and claw marks on tree trunks where bears had marked their territory. At the 1.3-mile mark, The officers encountered their first direct evidence of the food cache violations that had been reported by backpackers the previous week. Near a popular backcountry camping area, they discovered the remains of what had obviously been an improperly stored food cache that bears had torn apart and scattered across a wide area. Somebody definitely didn't follow the bear canister requirements, Ramirez observed, photographing the scattered remains of freeze-dried meals, energy bars, and camping equipment. Looks like the bears had themselves quite a feast. Carter examined the scene more closely, noting the extent of the damage and the evidence left by the bears that had accessed the food. Multiple animals were involved here, he determined, pointing out different sizes of paw prints in the soft soil around the campsite. At least one large adult, probably the same male we've been tracking, and what looks like a smaller bear, possibly a female with cubs. The implications of multiple bears learning to associate backcountry campsites with easily accessible food were serious. Once bears learned that human camping areas contained food rewards, they would actively seek out such sites, creating dangerous situations for future visitors and potentially requiring the bears to be relocated or, in worst-case scenarios, destroyed. The officers spent 45 minutes documenting the scene, collecting evidence that would be used to identify the individuals responsible for the improper food storage. Park regulations required all overnight visitors to carry certified bear canisters or hang food at least 12 feet high and 4 feet from tree trunks, violations that carried significant fines and possible criminal charges. By 11:20 a.m., they had completed their investigation of the food cache violation site and were continuing deeper into the wilderness area toward Quartz Lake itself. The trail became progressively more challenging, with several steep switchbacks and stream crossings that required careful footing on wet rocks and fallen logs. As they climbed toward the lake, the forest composition began to change, with more subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce, and the understory became dominated by huckleberry and mountain ash, both favored food sources for bears during the autumn months. The abundance of natural food sources in this area made it prime grizzly habitat, and both officers remained constantly alert for signs of bear presence. At approximately 12:15 p.m., as they approached the outlet of Lower Quartz Lake, Carter suddenly stopped and raised his hand in a signal for silence. Through the trees ahead, he had caught a glimpse of movement near the lake shore that appeared too large and the wrong color to be any of the area's other wildlife species. Using hand signals, Carter communicated to his partner that he had spotted what he believed to be a bear near the water's edge. Both officers moved carefully through the trees, positioning themselves where they could observe the animal without disturbing it or placing themselves in a potentially dangerous situation. What they saw through the trees was the same massive male grizzly they had observed earlier that morning, now feeding on spawning kokanee salmon in the shallow waters near the lake's outlet. The bear was wading in water approximately 18 inches deep, using its powerful paws and jaws to catch fish with remarkable efficiency. Each successful catch was followed by the bear moving to the shore to consume its prey, the sound of crunching bones and tearing flesh clearly audible from the officer's observation point. "This is incredible," Ramirez whispered, barely breathing as he watched the magnificent predator in its element. "Look at the power and coordination. It's like watching a perfectly evolved hunting machine." Carter was equally impressed, but also increasingly concerned about their tactical situation. They were approximately 80 yards from a 900-pound grizzly bear that was actively feeding, a scenario that wildlife biologists considered potentially dangerous. Bears defending food sources could become aggressive if they perceived threats to their meal, and the officer's position offered limited escape routes should the bear detect their presence and react negatively. "We need to start thinking about backing out of here," Carter whispered. "This bear is focused on feeding right now, but if it picks up our scent or spots us, the situation could change very quickly." As if responding to Carter's words, the massive grizzly suddenly raised its head from the water and began testing the air with its highly sensitive nose. The bear's entire demeanor changed from relaxed feeding behavior to alert wariness, its ears forward and head turning slowly as it attempted to locate the source of the human scent that had reached it. Both officers froze completely, knowing that any movement at this critical moment could trigger a defensive reaction from the bear. Grizzly bears possessed eyesight roughly equivalent to humans, but had hearing approximately twice as acute, and a sense of smell estimated to be 7 times more sensitive than that of a bloodhound. The bear was undoubtedly aware of their presence, but was still attempting to determine the exact location and nature of the threat. For nearly 3 full minutes, the officers remained motionless, while the bear continued its surveillance of the surrounding area. Finally, the grizzly apparently decided that the threat level was insufficient to abandon its fishing, and it returned to its feeding activities, though with noticeably increased alertness and frequent pauses to scan the shoreline. Carter and Ramirez began their careful withdrawal from the area, moving slowly and quietly back along the trail toward their vehicle. The encounter had provided valuable wildlife observation opportunities, but also reinforced the inherent risks of working in prime grizzly habitat during the pre-hibernation feeding period when bears were most active and potentially most aggressive in defending food sources. By 1:30 p.m., the officers had returned to their patrol vehicle and were preparing to conclude their backcountry patrol. They had documented significant bear activity throughout their sector, identified and recorded evidence of food cache violations, and observed behavior patterns that would be valuable for park biologists studying the local grizzly population. "I'm thinking we should head back and file our reports," Carter suggested as they secured their equipment in the patrol vehicle. "We've got plenty of documentation for today, and that big male is obviously very active in this area. Other units should be aware of his presence and behavior patterns." Ramirez agreed, but as Carter reached for the ignition key, their radio crackled with another transmission from Park Dispatcher Chen. All units. This is dispatch with a priority alert. We have received multiple reports of a very large grizzly bear exhibiting unusual behavior in the area of the North Fork Road, approximately 2 miles south of the Canadian border. Witnesses report the bear appears to be following vehicles and has approached several cars. All units in the vicinity are requested to respond for assessment and possible public safety action. Over. "Oh." Carter and Ramirez exchanged glances, both immediately recognizing that the bear described in the dispatch call likely matched the large male they had been tracking throughout their morning patrol. The location was approximately 12 miles from their current position, requiring a drive back through the same areas where they had observed the bear earlier. "Unit 847 responding," Carter transmitted. "We're currently at the Quartz Lakes trailhead and have been tracking a large male grizzly throughout our patrol sector this morning. Animal matches the description in your dispatch. ETA to North Fork Road, approximately 25 minutes. Over. Unit 847, copy your response. Please advise your estimated time of arrival and maintain radio contact en route. We have additional reports coming in from the same area suggesting the bear's behavior is escalating. Exercise extreme caution. Over." As they began the drive toward the reported incident location, both officers were acutely aware that bear behavior could change rapidly and unpredictably, especially during the high-stress pre-hibernation period. A bear that had appeared calm and non-threatening during morning observations could become aggressive and dangerous by afternoon, particularly if it had encountered negative interactions with humans or competition from other bears. The drive to the North Fork Road required navigating the same winding mountain roads they had traveled earlier, but now the stakes felt considerably higher. Reports of bears actively approaching vehicles represented a significant escalation in behavior that could indicate a food-conditioned animal, or worse, a bear that had learned to associate vehicles with easily accessible food sources. At 2:17 p.m., as their patrol vehicle rounded a sharp curve approximately 3 miles from the reported incident location, Carter spotted movement in his peripheral vision that caused him to immediately apply the brakes. Emerging from the dense timber on the right side of the road was the unmistakable form of the massive male grizzly bear they had been observing throughout the day. The bear appeared to be following a scent trail that led directly toward the roadway, moving with the purposeful gait that indicated it was tracking something specific rather than simply traveling through its territory. As the animal reached the edge of the pavement, it paused and raised its head, testing the air currents for the source of whatever had attracted its attention. "There's our boy," Carter said quietly, bringing the patrol vehicle to a complete stop approximately 50 yards from where the bear stood at the roadside. "And he's definitely exhibiting the kind of behavior described in those reports." The bear's attention was clearly focused on their vehicle, and after several seconds of observation, the animal began walking directly toward them along the roadway. This behavior was distinctly abnormal for a wild grizzly bear, which would typically avoid human contact and retreat into the forest when encountering vehicles. "This is not good," Ramirez observed, reaching for his radio microphone. "A bear that approaches vehicles instead of avoiding them is either sick, injured, or has become food-conditioned. Either way, it's a serious public safety threat." As Ramirez began transmitting their situation to dispatch, the bear continued its approach, showing no signs of the natural wariness that characterized normal grizzly behavior around humans. When the animal reached a distance of approximately 30 yards from their patrol vehicle, Carter made the decision to attempt to discourage its approach by activating the vehicle's emergency lights and siren. The effect was exactly opposite of what the officers had hoped to achieve. Instead of retreating from the loud noises and flashing lights, the bear appeared to become more interested in the patrol vehicle, accelerating its approach and beginning to circle around to the driver's side of the car. "Dispatch, Unit 847, Ramirez transmitted urgently. "We have direct contact with the large male grizzly at our current location on North Fork Road, approximately 3 miles south of the Canadian border. Bear is approaching our vehicle and not responding to standard deterrent measures. Requesting immediate backup and wildlife management support. Over." Unit 847, dispatch copies your transmission. No other units are immediately available in your area. Nearest backup is Unit 823, currently responding from West Glacier, ETA, approximately 45 minutes. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks has been notified and is dispatching a bear management specialist. Maintain safe distance and keep us advised of any changes in the situation. Over. As the radio transmission concluded, the massive grizzly had reached the driver's side of their patrol vehicle and was now investigating the door handle and window with obvious interest. The bear's behavior suggested it had previous positive experiences with vehicles, possibly indicating it had successfully accessed food from cars in the past. Carter attempted to slowly back away from the bear, but the animal immediately responded by moving to block their retreat, positioning itself directly in front of the vehicle. The bear then rose on its hind legs, placing its massive front paws against the hood of the patrol car and peering through the windshield directly at the 2 officers inside. The sight of the enormous grizzly bear standing against their vehicle, its head and shoulders extending well above the roofline, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The animal's dark eyes seemed to be evaluating the occupants of the vehicle, trying to determine if they represented a threat or a potential source of food. "Okay, we're in a serious situation here," Carter said, his voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This bear is exhibiting predatory behavior, and we're essentially trapped until backup arrives or the animal decides to move on. Ramirez was photographing the encounter with his duty camera, documenting the bear's behavior and their tactical situation for the incident report that would inevitably follow. The images captured the incredible size and power of the animal, as well as the precarious nature of their situation. For nearly 10 minutes, the bear continued its investigation of their vehicle, occasionally dropping to all fours to circle the car before returning to examine the windows and doors more closely. The animal's behavior suggested increasing frustration as it attempted to access what it apparently believed was a source of food inside the patrol car. At 2:41 p.m., the bear's behavior suddenly escalated dramatically. Instead of the investigative approach it had been displaying, the animal began striking the hood of their vehicle with its powerful front paws, producing loud metallic banging sounds that reverberated through the patrol car's interior. Each strike left visible dents in the metal and caused the entire vehicle to rock back and forth. "Jesus Christ," Ramirez breathed, watching in fascination and terror as the massive bear continued its assault on their patrol vehicle. "This thing could flip us over if it wanted to." The comment proved prophetic when the bear, apparently frustrated by its inability to access the interior of the vehicle through the hood, moved to the driver's side and began attempting to rock the patrol car by pushing against it with its shoulder and front paws. The Ford Police Interceptor utility weighed approximately 4,500 pounds, but the 900-pound grizzly bear was demonstrating that it possessed sufficient strength and leverage to move the vehicle significantly. "Hold on," Carter warned as the rocking motion became more violent. "If this thing tips us over, we're going to have bigger problems than we can handle." The bear's attacks on their vehicle continued to escalate, with the animal now biting at the door handles and window frames, trying to find a way to access the interior. The sound of the bear's massive jaws crunching on metal and plastic components was clearly audible inside the patrol car, and both officers could see the damage being inflicted on their vehicle. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the situation took a catastrophic turn. The massive grizzly bear, apparently enraged by its inability to access what it believed was food inside the patrol vehicle, reared up on its hind legs and brought the full force of its weight down on the driver's side of the car while simultaneously pushing with its powerful hind legs. The combined force of the bear's 900-pound mass and the explosive power of its leg muscles was sufficient to overcome the vehicle's center of gravity. The Ford Police Interceptor utility began to tilt onto its passenger side, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as gravity took over. "We're going over," Carter shouted as the patrol vehicle passed the point of no return and crashed onto its passenger side with a thunderous impact that shattered windows and activated the airbag system. The crash threw both officers against the passenger side of the vehicle, now the bottom of their overturned car. Carter struck his head against the passenger window, suffering a concussion and lacerations to his scalp, while Ramirez felt his left arm snap as he was thrown against the center console and door frame. In the immediate aftermath of the rollover, both officers were disoriented and injured, trapped inside their overturned patrol vehicle with a 900-pound grizzly bear continuing its attack just outside. The bear's behavior had escalated from investigative to aggressive, and now bordered on predatory as it began attempting to access the passenger compartment through the shattered windows. The bear's massive paws began reaching through the broken driver's side windows, now facing upward as it attempted to grab anything inside the vehicle. Carter and Ramirez found themselves pressed against what had been the passenger side windows, now the floor of their overturned car, trying to avoid the bear's claws while dealing with their injuries and the disorientation caused by the crash. "Radio," Carter managed to say through the pain in his head. "Need to get a mayday out." Ramirez, cradling his obviously broken left arm against his chest, managed to locate his radio with his good hand and key the microphone. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Unit 847. Our vehicle has been overturned by the grizzly bear, and both officers are injured and trapped inside. Bear is still attacking the vehicle. We need immediate emergency response, medical and bear management. Our location is North Fork Road, approximately 3 miles south of Canadian border. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. The transmission was heard not only by Park Dispatcher Chen, but also by every law enforcement and emergency services agency monitoring the Park Service radio frequencies. Within minutes, the largest emergency response operation in Glacier National Park history was being mobilized, involving Park Service units, Montana Fish Wildlife and Parks officers, Flathead County Sheriff's deputies, emergency medical services, and a helicopter from the Montana National Guard. Inside the overturned patrol vehicle, Carter and Ramirez faced their most desperate moments as the massive grizzly bear continued its relentless attempts to reach them through the broken windows. The bear's claws scraped against metal and glass as it tried to enlarge the openings, occasionally grabbing pieces of equipment or uniform fabric with its massive paws. "Bear spray," Carter said, fighting through the pain and disorientation. "If it gets its head through one of those windows, we need to be ready." Both officers had carried bear spray as standard equipment, but locating the canisters in the wreckage of their overturned vehicle while avoiding the bear's reaching claws proved extremely challenging. Ramirez managed to locate his canister with his good hand, but the awkward angle and his injuries made it difficult to position himself to use it effectively. The bear's frustration continued to grow as it was unable to access the officers, despite its powerful attempts to breach their metal shelter. The animal began biting at the vehicle's frame around the broken windows, its massive jaws powerful enough to deform metal and plastic components, but not quite sufficient to create an opening large enough for its massive head and shoulders. At 3:02 p.m., 15 minutes after the rollover, the bear suddenly ceased its attack and moved away from the vehicle, apparently distracted by something in the surrounding forest. Both officers could hear the animal moving around outside, but could no longer see it from their position, trapped inside the overturned patrol car. "Where did it go?" Ramirez whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might attract the bear's attention back to their vehicle. Carter was attempting to assess their tactical situation while dealing with what he suspected was a serious concussion. Blood from his scalp lacerations was running into his eyes, and he was experiencing the nausea and dizziness that typically accompanied head injuries. "Don't know, but we need to assume it's still in the immediate area. That radio call should have backup responding, but it's going to take time for them to get here." Nabish, the temporary respite from the bear's attack, allowed both officers to better assess their injuries and their situation. Carter's head wounds were bleeding profusely, but did not appear to be life-threatening, while Ramirez's left arm was obviously broken and would require immediate medical attention once they could be extracted from the vehicle. Their patrol car's emergency equipment had been scattered throughout the interior during the rollover, and both the computer terminal and radio equipment had been damaged in the crash. However, their portable radios remained functional, allowing them to maintain communication with dispatchers and responding units. At 3:08 p.m., Ramirez transmitted an update on their situation. "Dispatch, Unit 847. Both officers are injured but conscious and alert inside our overturned vehicle. Bear has temporarily moved away from our location but should be considered still in the immediate area. We need medical response and specialized equipment for vehicle extrication. Both officers have functional radio contact." Unit 847 dispatch copies. Multiple units are responding to your location, including Montana Fish Wildlife and Parks Bear Management, Flathead County EMS, and Park Service units. ETA of first responding unit is approximately 15 minutes. Montana National Guard helicopter is being dispatched from Kalispell for possible medical evacuation. Maintain radio contact and advise of any changes in your situation. The knowledge that help was responding provided some psychological comfort to the trapped officers, but they remained acutely aware that they were still in extreme danger. The bear had demonstrated its ability to overturn their vehicle and could potentially return to continue its attack at any moment. As they waited for rescue, both officers reflected on the events that had led to their current situation. The bear they had been tracking throughout the morning had exhibited increasingly bold behavior around humans and vehicles, suggesting it had become habituated to human presence and possibly conditioned to associate people with food sources. "You know what this means," Carter said, his voice reflecting both pain and the grim reality of their situation. "This bear is going to have to be destroyed. Once they start actively attacking vehicles and threatening human life, there's no rehabilitation possible." Ramirez nodded sadly, understanding the implications of their encounter. The magnificent animal they had observed feeding peacefully on salmon just hours earlier had demonstrated behavior that made it too dangerous to remain in contact with park visitors. Despite the bear's protected status within the national park, animals that posed direct threats to human safety had to be removed from the population. At 3:17 p.m., both officers heard the distinctive sound of multiple sirens approaching from the south, indicating that the first wave of emergency responders was nearing their location. The sound was both tremendously reassuring and potentially problematic, as the noise might attract the grizzly bear back to investigate the new arrivals. "Sounds like the cavalry is coming," Ramirez observed, managing a weak smile despite his pain and their precarious situation. Carter was monitoring the radio traffic between responding units and coordinating their approach to the accident scene. The rescue operation required careful coordination to ensure that emergency responders did not inadvertently encounter the dangerous grizzly bear while attempting to reach the trapped officers. The first unit to arrive at the scene was Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Bear Management Specialist Jennifer Walsh, a 15-year veteran of wildlife law enforcement who had dealt with hundreds of problem bear situations throughout her career. Walsh approached the overturned patrol vehicle in a specially equipped pickup truck that carried bear traps, chemical immobilization equipment, and specialized firearms designed for managing dangerous wildlife. "Unit 847, this is Bear Management arriving on scene," Walsh transmitted. "I can see your overturned vehicle, but no sign of the grizzly bear. What's your status and current location of the animal?" "Bear Management, Unit 847, Carter replied. "Both officers injured but stable inside our vehicle. Bear was last seen moving away from our location approximately 15 minutes ago, direction unknown. Animal exhibited extremely aggressive behavior and should be considered highly dangerous." Walsh began a systematic search of the immediate area, using binoculars and her extensive experience reading bear sign to locate the dangerous grizzly. The bear's tracks around the overturned patrol vehicle told a clear story of prolonged aggressive contact, with multiple sets of paw prints indicating the animal had circled the vehicle repeatedly while attempting to access the occupants. At 3:24 p.m., Walsh spotted the massive male grizzly approximately 200 yards from the accident scene, feeding on berries in a small clearing visible from the road. The bear appeared calm and showed no immediate interest in the emergency vehicles arriving at the scene, but Walsh knew that the situation could change rapidly. "All units, Bear Management. I have visual contact with the suspect bear approximately 200 yards northeast of the accident scene. Animal appears calm at this time, but should be considered extremely dangerous. I'm preparing chemical immobilization for safe capture and removal." The chemical immobilization of a 900-pound grizzly bear required precise calculation of drug dosages based on the animal's estimated weight and physical condition. Walsh prepared a dart containing a combination of telazol and medetomidine, drugs that would render the bear unconscious for several hours, allowing for safe handling and removal from the area. Emergency medical technicians from Flathead County EMS arrived at 3:28 p.m. and immediately began preparing equipment for extricating the injured officers from their overturned vehicle. The extrication process would require cutting tools to safely remove parts of the vehicle's structure without causing additional injuries to the trapped men. Paramedic Sarah Johnson, a 12-year veteran of emergency medical services, coordinated the medical response while maintaining constant communication with the officers inside the overturned patrol car. "Officers, this is EMS on scene. We're going to get you out of there as quickly and safely as possible. Can you tell me about your injuries and your condition right now?" Carter responded, "Head injury with significant bleeding and probable concussion. Officer Ramirez has what appears to be a fractured left arm. Both of us are conscious and alert, but experiencing significant pain." "Copy that, officers. We're coordinating with Bear Management to ensure scene safety before we begin extrication procedures. Hang in there. We'll have you out of there very soon." At 3:35 p.m., Bear Management Specialist Walsh successfully darted the massive grizzly bear with chemical immobilization drugs. The dart struck the animal in the shoulder muscle, delivering the calculated dose of anesthetic compounds directly into the bear's bloodstream. The bear initially showed no reaction to the dart impact, continuing to feed for several more minutes before the drugs began to take effect. The immobilization process took approximately 8 minutes from dart impact to complete unconsciousness, during which time the bear gradually became less coordinated and eventually collapsed in the small clearing where it had been feeding. Walsh monitored the animal throughout the process, ensuring that the drugs were taking effect properly and that the bear would remain unconscious for the duration of the rescue operation. "All units, Bear Management. The grizzly bear has been successfully immobilized and is no longer a threat to the rescue operation. EMS and extrication teams are cleared to approach the accident scene. With the bear safely immobilized, emergency medical technicians and fire department rescue specialists began the complex process of extricating Officers Carter and Ramirez from their overturned patrol vehicle. The extrication required cutting away portions of the vehicle's roof and door frames to create openings large enough to safely remove the injured officers while protecting them from additional trauma. The extrication process took 43 minutes, during which time both officers were continuously monitored by paramedics who had crawled partway into the wreckage to provide medical care. 4 lines were established, pain medications were administered, and both officers were prepared for immediate transport to Kalispell Regional Medical Center for definitive medical treatment. Officer Carter was the first to be removed from the vehicle at 4:18 p.m., carefully extracted through a large opening cut in what had been the passenger side roof. His head injuries required immediate attention, and he was quickly loaded into an ambulance for the 40-mile drive to the hospital. Despite his injuries, Carter remained conscious and was able to provide a preliminary statement about the incident to investigators. Officer Ramirez was extracted at 4:26 p.m., his broken left arm carefully splinted before he was moved from the wreckage. The fracture appeared to be clean and would likely heal completely with proper medical treatment, but the pain was considerable and required strong medications for management. Both officers were transported to Kalispell Regional Medical Center by ambulance, accompanied by Park Service supervisors and investigators who would need detailed statements about the incident once medical treatment was completed. The Montana Highway Patrol was also responding to conduct the official accident investigation, as required for any incident involving injuries to law enforcement officers. While the immediate rescue operation was concluding, Bear Management Specialist Walsh was faced with the difficult decision of what to do with the immobilized grizzly bear. Park policy generally favored relocating problem bears to remote areas rather than destroying them, but the aggressive nature of this particular animal's behavior made relocation inadvisable. The bear had demonstrated behavior patterns that wildlife biologists classified as predatory, meaning it actively sought out and attacked humans or human-related objects rather than simply defending itself or its food sources. Bears exhibiting predatory behavior rarely could be successfully rehabilitated and posed continuing public safety threats regardless of where they might be relocated. At 4:45 p.m., after consultation with park superintendents and wildlife biologists, the decision was made to euthanize the immobilized grizzly bear. The decision was not made lightly, as grizzly bears remained a protected species and every individual animal was valuable to the overall population. But public safety concerns outweighed conservation considerations in this particular case. The euthanization was carried out by lethal injection, while the bear remained unconscious from the immobilization drugs. Walsh performed the procedure herself, using barbiturate compounds that caused the animal's heart to stop without any pain or distress. The entire process was documented with photographs and witness statements as required by federal regulations governing the management of protected species. The massive grizzly bear weighed 947 pounds when measured at the park's maintenance facility, confirming the officers' estimates of the animal's size during their earlier observations. Biological samples were collected for disease testing and genetic analysis, standard procedures for all bears that were removed from the park's population. A necropsy performed by park veterinarians revealed that the bear was in excellent physical condition, with no signs of disease, injury, or malnutrition that might have explained its unusual behavior. The animal's stomach contents included berries, fish remains, and small amounts of human food packaging, suggesting that the bear had indeed become conditioned to associate humans with easily accessible food sources. The discovery of food packaging in the bear's digestive system supported the theory that the animal had learned to seek out campsites and vehicles as potential food sources, leading to the increasingly bold behavior that ultimately resulted in the attack on the patrol vehicle. This finding reinforced the critical importance of proper food storage protocols in bear country and the severe consequences that could result from violations. Officers Carter and Ramirez arrived at Kalispell Regional Medical Center at 5:23 p.m. and 5:31 p.m. respectively, where they were immediately assessed by emergency department physicians. Both men underwent extensive medical evaluation, including CT scans, X-rays, and neurological assessments to determine the full extent of their injuries. Carter's head injuries required 12 stitches to close the scalp lacerations, and his CT scan revealed a mild concussion with no evidence of skull fractures or intracranial bleeding. He was admitted to the hospital for overnight observation due to the head injury, but was expected to make a full recovery within several weeks. Ramirez's left arm fracture involved both the radius and ulnar bones near the wrist, requiring surgical repair with metal plates and screws to ensure proper healing. The surgery was performed by orthopedic surgeon Dr. Michael Thompson and lasted approximately 2 hours. Ramirez was expected to require 6 to 8 weeks of recovery time before returning to full duty. Both officers' families were notified of the incident and traveled to Kalispell to be with them during their recovery. Carter's wife, Linda, and their twin daughters arrived at the hospital at 7:45 p.m., while Ramirez's fiancée, Sarah, arrived shortly after 8 p.m. The presence of family members provided tremendous emotional support during the difficult aftermath of their traumatic experience. The incident immediately became a major news story throughout the region, with television stations and newspapers sending reporters to cover what was being described as one of the most dramatic bear attacks in recent park history. The fact that law enforcement officers had been attacked while performing their duties added an additional element of public interest to the story. Park Service Public Information Officer Maria Santos held a press conference at 6 p.m. on September 11th to provide official details about the incident and the emergency response. Santos emphasized the rarity of such aggressive bear behavior and reassured the public that appropriate measures had been taken to eliminate the threat to visitor safety. This was an extremely unusual incident involving a bear that exhibited highly abnormal behavior, Santos explained to the assembled media. Our officers were performing routine patrol duties when they encountered an animal that posed an immediate threat to public safety. Both officers acted professionally throughout the incident, and we are grateful that their injuries, while serious, are not life-threatening. The investigation into the incident would continue for several weeks, involving detailed analysis of the officers' equipment, their vehicle, and all available evidence from the scene. The investigation aimed to determine whether any changes in equipment, procedures, or training might help prevent similar incidents in the future. The overturned patrol vehicle was recovered from the scene on September 12th and transported to the park's maintenance facility for detailed examination. The extent of the damage was remarkable, with the bear's claws and teeth leaving deep gouges in metal and plastic surfaces throughout the exterior of the vehicle. The damage pattern provided clear evidence of the sustained and violent nature of the bear's attack. Investigators also recovered the officers' body-worn cameras, which had recorded portions of the incident. The footage provided valuable documentation of the bear's behavior and the officers' response to the emergency situation. The recordings would be used both for the official investigation and for training purposes to help other officers prepare for similar encounters. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a wildlife biologist with the University of Montana who specialized in grizzly bear behavior, was consulted to provide expert analysis of the incident. Dr. Morrison reviewed all available evidence, including photographs, video recordings, and witness statements, to develop a comprehensive understanding of the factors that led to the bear's aggressive behavior. This appears to be a case of a food-conditioned bear that had learned to associate humans and vehicles with easily accessible food sources, Dr. Morrison concluded in her report. The bear's persistent and escalating attempts to access the officer's vehicle, combined with its lack of natural wariness around humans, suggests significant prior positive experiences with human-related food sources. Dr. Morrison's analysis supported the Park Service's decision to euthanize the bear, as animals exhibiting such behavior patterns posed continuing threats to public safety and were unlikely to be successfully rehabilitated through relocation or other management techniques. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of bear management policies throughout the National Park Service, with particular attention to visitor education about proper food storage and bear safety protocols. The review also examined equipment and training provided to law enforcement officers who worked in bear country, seeking ways to improve their safety and effectiveness in managing dangerous wildlife encounters. Officer Carter was discharged from Kalispell Regional Medical Center on September 12th after his overnight observation period revealed no complications from his head injury. He was placed on medical leave and would require several weeks of recovery time before being cleared to return to duty. The concussion symptoms, including headaches and dizziness, were expected to resolve gradually over the following month. Officer Ramirez remained hospitalized for 3 days following his surgery, during which time medical staff monitored his recovery and began physical therapy to maintain range of motion in his injured arm. He was discharged on September 14th with detailed instructions for home care and follow-up appointments with his orthopedic surgeon. Both officers were required to undergo psychological evaluation and counseling as part of their recovery process, standard procedure for law enforcement personnel who had experienced traumatic incidents. The psychological support was designed to help them process the emotional impact of their experience and identify any symptoms of post-traumatic stress that might require treatment. The incident had a profound impact on both officers who had dedicated their careers to protecting park visitors and wildlife. The knowledge that their encounter had resulted in the death of a magnificent grizzly bear was particularly difficult, even though they understood the necessity of the decision for public safety reasons. It's hard to accept that such a beautiful, powerful animal had to die because of what happened, Carter reflected during a newspaper interview several weeks after the incident. We knew the risks when we took these jobs, but we never expected to be in a situation where our presence led to a bear being destroyed. The incident also sparked broader discussions about human-wildlife interactions in national parks and the ongoing challenges of managing growing visitor populations in pristine wilderness areas. As more people sought outdoor recreation opportunities in bear country, the potential for dangerous encounters continued to increase, requiring constant vigilance and education efforts. Park officials used the incident as an opportunity to reinforce messaging about bear safety and proper food storage protocols. Additional bear-resistant food storage containers were installed at popular camping areas, and visitor education programs were expanded to include more detailed information about bear behavior and safety procedures. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Agency also reviewed its protocols for managing problem bears, seeking ways to identify and address food conditioning behavior before it escalated to dangerous levels. The incident demonstrated the importance of early intervention when bears began exhibiting abnormal behavior around humans or human-related food sources. Officer Ramirez returned to light duty on November 15, 2024, approximately 9 weeks after the incident. His arm had healed well following surgery, and physical therapy had restored full range of motion and strength. However, he requested assignment to administrative duties rather than field patrol work, at least temporarily, while he continued to process the psychological impact of his experience. Officer Carter returned to full duty on October 22, 2024, after being cleared by both medical and psychological evaluators. His head injury had healed completely with no lasting complications, and he expressed eagerness to return to the work he loved, despite the traumatic nature of his recent experience. The wilderness is still beautiful, and the wildlife is still magnificent, Carter said during his first day back on patrol. What happened to us was extremely rare, and I'm not going to let one incident change my love for this place or my commitment to protecting it. The incident remained a topic of discussion and analysis within the law enforcement and wildlife management communities for months afterward. The dramatic nature of the encounter, combined with the excellent documentation provided by the officer's equipment and witness accounts, made it a valuable case study for training and educational purposes. Law enforcement agencies throughout the western United States incorporated lessons learned from the Glacier National Park incident into their training programs for officers working in bear country. The incident highlighted the importance of situational awareness, emergency communication procedures, and the need for specialized equipment when working in areas with dangerous wildlife. The overturned patrol vehicle was eventually repaired and returned to service, though not without some discussion about whether it should be retired due to its association with the traumatic incident. Park officials ultimately decided that repairing the vehicle was more practical and cost-effective than replacement, and it served for several more years before being retired through normal fleet rotation. A memorial plaque was installed at the Bowman Lake Campground Visitor Center, not commemorating the incident itself, but honoring the dedicated service of law enforcement officers who work to protect both park visitors and wildlife. The plaque served as a reminder of the inherent risks faced by those who choose to work in wilderness environments and the importance of respecting the power and unpredictability of wild animals. The incident also led to improvements in emergency response procedures for remote areas of the park, including better coordination between multiple agencies and enhanced communication equipment for officers working alone in backcountry areas. The successful rescue operation, despite its complexity and the dangerous circumstances, demonstrated the effectiveness of well-coordinated emergency response systems. Dr. Morrison's comprehensive analysis of the incident was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and became required reading in university wildlife biology programs throughout North America. Her work contributed to a better understanding of food conditioning behavior in grizzly bears and the factors that could lead to dangerous encounters with humans. The incident served as a stark reminder that even experienced wildlife professionals could find themselves in life-threatening situations when dealing with large, powerful predators in their natural environment. The fact that both officers survived their ordeal was attributed to their training, their equipment, and ultimately, good fortune in the form of timely rescue response. Years later, both Carter and Ramirez continued their careers in law enforcement, though their experience on September 11, 2024, remained a defining moment in their professional lives. They regularly shared their story with other officers and park visitors, using their experience to educate others about wildlife safety and the importance of respecting the dangerous power of wild animals. The massive grizzly bear that attacked their vehicle was preserved through taxidermy and became part of an educational display at the park's visitor center, where it served to educate thousands of visitors about bear biology, behavior, and safety. The display included detailed information about the incident and the factors that led to the bear's aggressive behavior, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of proper food storage and wildlife safety protocols. The September 11th incident became part of the official history of Glacier National Park, documented in annual reports, safety statistics, and training materials used by the National Park Service. It stood as one of the most dramatic examples of human-wildlife conflict in the park's history and continued to influence policies and procedures for managing both visitors and dangerous wildlife. In the years following the incident, bear activity in the area where the attack occurred returned to normal patterns, with no repeat of the aggressive behavior that had characterized the destroyed animal. Park biologists continued monitoring the local grizzly population and maintaining the food storage and visitor education programs that were essential for preventing similar incidents in the future. The two officers, their families, and the entire Park Service community had been forever changed by the events of that September morning, when a routine patrol had turned into a life-threatening encounter with one of North America's most powerful predators. The incident served as a testament to the courage and dedication of those who chose to work in some of the world's most beautiful and dangerous places, protecting both the wilderness and those who came to experience it. The next stories. The Kodiak Shadow. The morning mist clung to the towering spruce trees of Shuyak Island like ghostly fingers, refusing to release their grip even as the September sun climbed higher above the Alaskan wilderness. Fire Captain Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his radio headset and squinted through the helicopter's windscreen at the remote landscape below, a vast expanse of emerald forest punctuated by silver streams and the occasional clearing where ancient glacial activity had carved out meadows, now thick with fireweed and wild blueberries. The Bell 212 twin-engine helicopter thrummed steadily beneath him, its rotors cutting through the crisp morning air, as pilot Jake Morrison navigated through the mountain passes with the practiced ease of someone who had been flying these treacherous skies for over 15 years. ETA to the drop zone is 12 minutes, Cap, Morrison called over the engine noise, his weathered hands steady on the controls. At 43, Morrison had seen it all in his years flying rescue missions throughout the Kodiak archipelago, from medical evacuations off fishing vessels to search and rescue operations for lost hikers. But something about this particular call had him on edge. Maybe it was the unusual nature of the reported fire, started not by lightning or human carelessness, but by what appeared to be a downed aircraft. Or perhaps it was the complete radio silence from the area, since the initial distress call had come in 6 hours earlier from a passing commercial fishing vessel. Rodriguez nodded and turned to address his crew, 5 seasoned firefighters from the Kodiak Island Fire Department, who had volunteered for what was being classified as a high-risk wilderness response mission. Listen up, people. We're looking at a potential aircraft fire in extremely remote terrain. No roads, no trails, and definitely no cell coverage. The closest civilization is the village of Larsen Bay, and that's still 40 miles southeast of our position. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, 29 years old, and the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had settled in Alaska in the 1980s, checked her gear one final time. Her pack contained specialized firefighting foam, medical supplies, and emergency rations for 72 hours. She had joined the department 3 years earlier after completing her EMT certification and had quickly earned a reputation for her calm demeanor under pressure and her encyclopedic knowledge of wilderness survival techniques learned during weekend expeditions with her father, a former park ranger who had instilled in her a deep respect for the Alaskan wilderness and its dangers. "What do we know about the aircraft?" asked firefighter James Thompson, a stocky man in his early 30s whose thick beard and flannel shirt made him look more like a lumberjack than a firefighter. Thompson had grown up in a logging family and possessed an intimate knowledge of forest fires that had proven invaluable during his 8 years with the department. His expertise in reading fire behavior and predicting flame spread patterns had saved countless acres of timber and numerous lives. Rodriguez consulted his clipboard, his dark eyes scanning the handwritten notes he had taken during the morning briefing. Single-engine Cessna 180, tail number November 74 Charlie Fox. Pilot was Robert Harrison, age 57, flying solo from Anchorage to Kodiak with supplies for a research station. Lost contact with air traffic control at approximately 03:15 hours. Commercial fishing vessel Aleutian Dawn spotted smoke and flames around 07:30 and radioed it in. The helicopter banked left as Morrison adjusted their course to avoid a towering cumulus cloud that had formed over the mountain peaks. Through the side window, the crew could see the vast expanse of Shuyak Island State Park stretching below them, over 47,000 acres of pristine wilderness that served as critical habitat for brown bears, black bears, and the massive Kodiak bears that could reach weights exceeding 1,500 pounds. The island's ecosystem remained largely untouched by human development, with dense forests of Sitka spruce and western hemlock creating a canopy so thick that in many areas the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Firefighter Daniel Morales, 31 years old, and the newest member of the crew, with just 18 months on the job, pressed his face to the window and marveled at the untamed landscape below. Morales had transferred to Alaska from Phoenix, drawn by the adventure and the opportunity to work in one of the most challenging firefighting environments in the world. His background in desert firefighting had required significant adaptation to the unique conditions of the Alaskan wilderness, where hypothermia posed as much danger as flames, and where wildlife encounters were a constant concern. "Jesus, look at the size of this place," Morales muttered. his breath fogging the helicopter's window. How are we supposed to find one downed plane in all that? Same way we always do, replied firefighter Amy Walsh, a 27-year-old former military medic whose tour in Afghanistan had prepared her for the psychological challenges of emergency response work. Walsh had joined the fire department after completing her service, drawn by the opportunity to use her medical training in a civilian capacity. Her combat experience had taught her to remain calm in crisis situations, but it had also left her with a heightened awareness of danger that sometimes manifested as an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong. Walsh felt that familiar tingle of unease now as she studied the terrain below. The forest seemed too quiet, too still, and she found herself unconsciously checking her sidearm, a Glock 20 loaded with hot 10mm rounds specifically designed for large predator defense. All crew members carried bear spray and firearms as standard equipment when operating in known bear country, but Walsh's military training made her more comfortable with weapons than most of her colleagues. "Grid search pattern," Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "We'll start at the last known GPS coordinates and work outward in expanding circles. Keep your eyes peeled for smoke, debris, or anything that looks out of place." The sixth member of the crew, firefighter Rebecca Stone, 35 years old and a veteran of 12 years with various fire departments throughout the Pacific Northwest, adjusted her binoculars and began systematically scanning the forest canopy below. Stone had earned her reputation through her exceptional eyesight and her ability to spot signs of fire or distress from great distances. Her methodical approach to search patterns had resulted in numerous successful rescue missions, and Rodriguez had specifically requested her for this operation. "There!" Stone called out suddenly, pointing toward a clearing roughly 2 miles northeast of their position. Smoke plume, thin and white, could be smoldering wreckage. Morrison immediately adjusted course, the helicopter's engines whining as he increased power to climb over a ridgeline. As they crested the hill, the crash site became clearly visible below. A Cessna 180 had impacted at a steep angle, its wings sheared off by massive spruce trees, the fuselage crumpled like an accordion against a boulder field. White smoke drifted lazily from the wreckage, suggesting that while the initial fire had largely burned itself out, hot spots remained among the debris. "That's our bird," Rodriguez confirmed, keying his radio to report their findings to the Kodiak Island Dispatch Center. "Kodiak Dispatch, this is Fire Captain Rodriguez. We have located the downed aircraft at coordinates 60 degrees, 12.4 minutes north, 152 degrees, 47.8 minutes west, preparing for insertion and assessment." The response crackled back through static. "Copy that, Captain Rodriguez." "Be advised, Alaska State Troopers are dispatching an investigative team, but they won't reach your location until tomorrow morning due to weather conditions. You are authorized to secure the scene and conduct search and rescue operations as necessary." Morrison circled the crash site twice, looking for a suitable landing zone. The terrain was challenging, with steep slopes covered in dense vegetation and scattered with glacial boulders that could easily damage the helicopter's landing gear. Finally, he identified a small meadow approximately 300 yards from the wreckage, clear enough for a safe landing, but requiring the crew to hike through thick forest to reach the crash site. "This is as close as we can get," Morrison announced, beginning his approach to the meadow. "I'll maintain radio contact, but once you're in that forest, you're going to lose satellite reception pretty quickly. Standard protocol applies. Check in every 30 minutes, and if I don't hear from you for 2 hours, I'm calling for backup." The helicopter touched down with a gentle thud, its rotors continuing to spin as the crew quickly unloaded their equipment. Each firefighter carried approximately 60 pounds of gear, including specialized foam units for aircraft fires, medical supplies, emergency shelter materials, and enough food and water for 3 days. The total value of equipment being deployed exceeded $150,000, representing some of the most advanced firefighting technology available for wilderness operations. Rodriguez was the first to step onto the spongy tundra, immediately noting the profound silence that enveloped them as soon as Morrison reduced engine power. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the spruce branches and the distant call of a Steller's jay. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn, mixed with the faint, acrid smell of burned aviation fuel and melted plastic drifting from the crash site. "Remember, people," Rodriguez addressed his crew as they shouldered their packs, "this is brown bear country, and we're right in the middle of salmon season. Bears are going to be active and aggressive as they prepare for winter. Stay alert, stay together, and don't take any unnecessary risks." Chen checked her GPS unit and compass, calculating the bearing to the crash site. 270 degrees magnetic, approximately 300 meters through dense forest. Terrain looks challenging, with significant elevation changes. The crew formed a loose column with Rodriguez in the lead, followed by Chen navigating, then Thompson and Walsh in the middle, with Stone and Morales bringing up the rear. They moved slowly through the forest, carefully picking their way over fallen logs and through thickets of devil's club, whose thorny stems could slice through clothing and flesh with equal ease. The Sitka spruces towered above them, some exceeding 200 feet in height and boasting trunk diameters of 6 feet or more. These ancient giants had stood for centuries, weathering storms and fires, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere beneath their spreading branches. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of moss and fallen needles that muffled their footsteps but concealed potential hazards like hidden roots and loose rocks. 20 minutes into their approach march, Thompson suddenly held up his hand, signaling the crew to halt. "Fresh sign," he whispered, pointing to a massive paw print pressed deep into the soft earth beside a small stream. The track measured nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with clearly visible claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the toe pads. Walsh knelt beside the track, studying it with the analytical eye of someone trained in tracking and fieldcraft. "That's a big male, probably over 800 pounds. Track's fresh, maybe 6 to 8 hours old." She looked up at the surrounding forest with increased wariness. "He's moving parallel to our route, heading toward the crash site." Stone photographed the track with her digital camera, noting the GPS coordinates for inclusion in their incident report. "Could just be coincidence. Bears investigate anything unusual in their territory, and an aircraft crash would definitely qualify as unusual." Rodriguez made the decision to continue toward the crash site, but implemented additional safety protocols. "We maintain 15-foot spacing between team members. Bear spray ready, safety's off on firearms. If anyone sees movement in the brush, we stop and assess before proceeding." The forest seemed to close in around them as they continued their approach, the canopy growing thicker and the undergrowth more dense. Periodic breaks in the trees revealed glimpses of the smoking wreckage ahead, but the crash site remained frustratingly elusive as they navigated around natural obstacles and difficult terrain. Morales, hiking at the rear of the column, found himself constantly looking over his shoulder and startling at every sound. His desert firefighting experience had not prepared him for the claustrophobic feeling of moving through dense forest, where visibility was limited to just a few yards in any direction. Every shadow seemed to conceal potential threats, and every snapping twig made him reach reflexively for his bear spray. "How do you guys stand it out here?" he whispered to Stone, who was hiking just ahead of him. "I feel like something's watching us." Stone smiled grimly. "Something probably is. This is their home, not ours. The key is respecting that fact and staying alert without becoming paranoid." She paused to examine broken branches on a nearby shrub. "Though I have to admit, something feels off about this whole situation." They had covered approximately 2/3 of the distance to the crash site when Chen, still leading navigation, stopped abruptly and held up her hand. "Does anyone else smell that?" she asked quietly. The crew paused, sniffing the air carefully. The acrid smell of burned aircraft components was stronger now, as expected. But there was something else underlying it, a sweet, cloying odor that seemed out of place in the pristine wilderness environment. Thompson, whose years in the logging industry had exposed him to numerous wildlife encounters, immediately recognized the smell. "That's decomposition," he said grimly. "Something died recently, and it's not far from here." Rodriguez consulted his handheld GPS unit, confirming their position relative to the crash site. "Could be the pilot. We need to be prepared for what we might find when we reach the aircraft." The final approach to the crash site required them to scramble up a steep slope covered in loose scree and fallen logs. The Cessna had impacted the hillside at nearly a 45-degree angle, its nose buried deep in the rocky soil, the engine compartment completely crushed by the force of the collision. The wings had been torn off during the crash sequence, leaving jagged metal stumps protruding from the fuselage. One wing lay crumpled against a massive spruce trunk 50 yards away, while the other had apparently been thrown even farther by the impact. "Jesus Christ," Walsh muttered as she got her first clear look at the wreckage. The aircraft had been completely destroyed, its aluminum skin peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the debris field. Clothing, books, electronic equipment, and what appeared to be research materials and supplies intended for a remote weather station. Rodriguez immediately began assessing the scene for safety hazards. Aviation fuel had leaked extensively from the ruptured tanks, saturating the soil and creating a significant fire hazard despite the passage of several hours since the crash. The aircraft's battery had apparently exploded during the impact, scattering acid and electronic components across a wide area. Chen, Stone, establish a perimeter and start documenting everything with photographs, Rodriguez ordered. Thompson, Walsh, you're with me. We need to check for survivors and secure any hazardous materials. The approach to the cockpit required extreme caution as the crew navigated through twisted metal and debris. The aircraft's windscreen had been completely shattered, and the instrument panel was crushed beyond recognition. Rodriguez peered through the wreckage, using his flashlight to illuminate the dark interior. "I can see the pilot," he reported grimly. "Definitely deceased. Looks like massive trauma from the impact." He paused, studying the scene more carefully. "Wait a minute. Something's not right here." Walsh joined him at the cockpit opening, her medical training allowing her to assess the situation with clinical detachment. What she saw made her stomach clench with a mixture of professional concern and primitive fear. "Cap, that's not just trauma from the crash. Look at the condition of the body." The pilot's remains showed evidence of extensive post-mortem damage that was clearly not related to the aircraft collision. Large sections of soft tissue had been removed, and the pattern of damage was consistent with predation by a large carnivore. Clothing had been torn away in strips, and deep gouges in the aircraft's metal skin suggested that something with extremely powerful claws had worked to extract the body from the wreckage. Thompson, who had been examining the surrounding area, called out from 20 yards away, "Rodriguez, you need to see this. We've got major bear sign all around the crash site." The crew regrouped near a large spruce tree, where Thompson had discovered clear evidence of bear activity. The bark had been stripped away in long vertical gouges, extending from ground level to nearly 8 feet high, and the tree was marked with tufts of coarse brown hair caught in the rough bark. Massive paw prints circled the tree in a pattern that suggested the animal had been marking territory or possibly agitated by the presence of the aircraft wreckage. "This is a mature male Kodiak bear," Stone observed, examining the claw marks with professional interest. Based on the height of these scratches and the size of the tracks we saw earlier, I'd estimate him at over 10 feet tall when standing on his hind legs. Chen was photographing the evidence when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Guys, these tracks aren't just old ones from this morning. Look at this." She pointed to a series of fresh impressions in the soft earth near the crash site. These were made within the last hour, maybe less. The realization that they were sharing the immediate area with a massive predator that had already claimed one victim sent a chill through the entire crew. Rodriguez immediately reassessed their tactical situation, noting their position relative to escape routes and calculating the time it would take to return to the helicopter. "New plan," he announced. "We document what we can quickly and get out of here. This bear has claimed this territory, and we're not equipped for an extended confrontation with an animal that size." Walsh was securing the pilot's remains and collecting personal effects for later identification when she heard a sound that made her freeze in place. From somewhere in the dense forest behind them came a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The sound was unlike anything she had heard during her military service, deeper and more menacing than any human conflict she had experienced. "That's not good," Thompson whispered, slowly reaching for his sidearm while trying not to make any sudden movements. "That's a warning growl. He's telling us we're in his territory." The crew instinctively moved closer together, forming a defensive circle with their backs to the aircraft wreckage. Rodriguez keyed his radio, attempting to contact Morrison and request immediate extraction, but the radio crackled with static. The dense forest canopy and mountainous terrain were blocking their communications with the helicopter. "How far are we from the landing zone?" Rodriguez asked Chen quietly. 300 meters through dense forest," she replied, consulting her GPS unit. 15 to 20 minutes at normal pace, but if we're being stalked." Another growl echoed through the forest, this time from a different direction and noticeably closer. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as the bear used his intimate knowledge of the terrain to remain concealed while positioning himself for optimal advantage. Stone had been studying the surrounding forest with her binoculars, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance in the vegetation. "There," she whispered, pointing toward a thicket of alder bushes approximately 50 yards to their northeast. "Something big is moving through those trees." The bushes swayed and rustled as something large pushed through them, but the dense foliage prevented a clear sighting of whatever was causing the disturbance. The crew could hear the occasional snap of breaking branches and the soft thud of heavy paws on the forest floor, but their tormentor remained frustratingly invisible. Morales, whose nerves were already stretched to the breaking point by his unfamiliarity with this environment, made the mistake of taking several steps away from the group to get a better view of the area Stone had indicated. His movement immediately triggered a response from their hidden observer, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very trees around them. "Get back here, Morales!" Rodriguez hissed urgently. "Don't separate from the group!" But it was too late. The massive Kodiak bear, apparently interpreting Morales' movement as a threat or challenge, burst from the undergrowth like a brown avalanche, moving with terrifying speed despite his enormous size. The bear stood nearly 11 feet tall on his hind legs, his massive head swaying from side to side as he assessed the group of humans who had invaded his territory and disturbed his feeding site. The animal was a magnificent and terrifying specimen of Kodiak brown bear, weighing well over 1,200 pounds and bearing the scars of numerous battles with other bears and the harsh Alaskan environment. His fur was a rich chocolate brown, with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the forest canopy. His eyes were small and dark, but they held an intelligence that was somehow more unsettling than simple animal aggression. "Nobody move," Walsh whispered, her military training automatically taking over as she assessed the tactical situation. Bears often bluff charge. If we stay calm and don't threaten him, he might back down. For several long seconds, bear and humans regarded each other across the forest clearing. The bear's massive head moved slowly from side to side, his sensitive nose gathering information about these strange intruders. His body language suggested wariness rather than immediate aggression, and for a moment it seemed as though the encounter might end without violence. Then Morales, panicked by the sight of the enormous predator and forgetting all his training, made a critical error. He reached for his bear spray canister, and the sudden movement triggered the bear's attack response. With a roar that sounded like thunder rolling across the mountains, the Kodiak charged. The speed of the bear's attack was shocking. Despite his massive size, the animal moved across the forest floor like a freight train, covering the 50 yards between himself and the crew in less than 4 seconds. His powerful legs propelled him forward with ground-eating strides, and his massive paws barely seemed to touch the earth as he closed the distance. Thompson managed to deploy his bear spray, sending a stream of concentrated capsaicin toward the charging animal, but the wind direction was wrong, and the spray dispersed harmlessly to one side. Stone drew her pistol and fired 2 shots, both hitting the bear in the shoulder, but the heavy bone and muscle mass absorbed the impact without significantly slowing the attack. The bear struck Morales with the force of a small automobile, his massive paw sweeping the firefighter off his feet and sending him flying into the aircraft wreckage. The sound of the impact was sickeningly wet, like a sledgehammer hitting a watermelon, and Morales's scream was cut short as he collided with the twisted metal fuselage. "Fall back to the helicopter!" Rodriguez shouted, but even as he gave the order, he knew they would never make it. The bear had positioned himself between the crew and their escape route, and his territorial instincts were now fully engaged. This was no longer about food or curiosity. This was about defending his claimed territory from invaders. Chen and Walsh managed to deploy their bear spray simultaneously, creating a wider cloud of irritant that finally seemed to affect the massive animal. The bear shook his head violently and backed away several steps, clawing at his eyes and nose with his massive paws. But rather than retreating, the bear's aggression only intensified as the spray caused him pain and disorientation. Stone continued firing her pistol, emptying the magazine into the bear's massive body, but the animal's thick hide and layers of fat and muscle absorbed the rounds without causing immediately debilitating damage. Bears, particularly large males like this Kodiak, were notoriously difficult to stop with handgun rounds, their anatomy designed to absorb tremendous punishment while continuing to function. The bear turned his attention to Stone, apparently identifying her as the primary threat due to her use of the firearm. He charged toward her with renewed fury, his massive jaws agape, revealing teeth the size of railroad spikes. Stone managed to dive behind a fallen log just as the bear's claws swept through the space where she had been standing, the razor-sharp talons easily gouging deep furrows in the rotting wood. Rodriguez and Thompson were attempting to assist Morales, who was unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple lacerations caused by his impact with the aircraft debris. His left arm was clearly broken in multiple places, and blood was flowing freely from deep gashes across his scalp and face. Without immediate medical attention, he would not survive long enough to reach the hospital in Kodiak. "We need to get him out of here," Thompson shouted over the sounds of the continuing battle between the bear and the rest of the crew. "He's going into shock!" But their position was hopeless. The bear had effectively trapped them in the crash site area, using the natural terrain and his superior knowledge of the environment to prevent their escape. Every time they attempted to move toward the helicopter landing zone, the massive animal would position himself to block their route, roaring his challenges and making threatening gestures with his massive paws. Chen, who had been conserving her bear spray for maximum effectiveness, waited until the bear was focused on Stone and then approached from his blind side. She managed to empty her entire canister directly into the animal's face from a distance of less than 10 feet, finally causing enough pain and disorientation to make him temporarily retreat. "This is our chance," Rodriguez yelled. "Thompson, you carry Morales. Everyone else covering formation around them. Move!" The crew attempted their fighting withdrawal from the crash site, carrying their injured comrade while maintaining defensive positions against the temporarily blinded bear, but they had barely covered 50 yards when the animal's vision began to clear, and his fury at being injured and humiliated reached a new peak. The bear's second attack was even more devastating than the first. Enraged by the pain from the bear spray and the multiple gunshot wounds, he abandoned any pretense of defensive behavior and committed fully to destroying the human intruders. He struck the fleeing group like a natural disaster, his massive body bowling over Chen and Walsh while his claws raked across Thompson's back as the firefighter tried to shield Morales from the assault. Stone, who had reloaded her pistol, managed to put 3 more rounds into the bear's head and neck area, but the animal's skull was too thick and the angles too poor for the bullets to penetrate to vital organs. The shots only seemed to enrage the bear further, and he turned his full attention to eliminating what he perceived as his primary tormentor. The bear's attack on Stone was swift and brutal. His massive jaws clamped down on her left shoulder, and the crew could hear bones snapping like dry twigs under the tremendous pressure. Stone's screams echoed through the forest as the bear shook her like a terrier with a rat, her body whipping back and forth with ragdoll physics that spoke to the incredible power of the animal's neck and jaw muscles. Walsh, despite her own injuries from being bowled over by the bear's charge, managed to draw her sidearm and put several rounds into the bear's torso at point-blank range. The 10mm rounds finally began to have some cumulative effect, and the bear released Stone and staggered backward, blood flowing from multiple wounds. But the damage had already been done. Stone was unconscious and bleeding heavily from massive trauma to her shoulder and upper chest. Morales remained critically injured from his initial impact with the aircraft wreckage. Thompson was lacerated across his back and losing blood steadily. Only Rodriguez, Chen, and Walsh remained capable of fighting, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. The bear, though wounded, was far from defeated. Kodiaks were renowned for their incredible toughness and their ability to continue fighting even with severe injuries. This particular male had survived numerous battles with other bears and had developed an almost supernatural resistance to pain and trauma. Rodriguez made the hardest decision of his career. "We can't save them if we're all dead," he told Chen and Walsh grimly. "We abandon the equipment and make for the helicopter. Now." The 3 surviving crew members left their fallen comrades and began a desperate flight through the forest toward the helicopter landing zone. Behind them, the wounded bear let out a roar of triumph that seemed to shake the very mountains, claiming his victory over the human invaders. The retreat through the dense forest was a nightmare of torn clothing, scratched faces, and constant terror that the bear was pursuing them. Every shadow seemed to conceal the massive predator, and every snapping branch sounded like his approach. The crew members were running on pure adrenaline, their bodies pushed far beyond normal endurance limits by the desperate need to reach safety. Chen, navigating by GPS and compass while running through difficult terrain, performed minor miracles of land navigation as she led them through the densest parts of the forest, where the bear's massive size would be a disadvantage. They crashed through thickets of Devil's Club, splashed across swift mountain streams, and scrambled over fallen logs, always moving toward the distant sound of the helicopter's engines. Morrison, monitoring radio frequencies from the helicopter, had heard the distant gunshots and knew something had gone terribly wrong. He had been attempting to raise the crew on their radios for over 30 minutes without success, and his concern was mounting with each passing minute. When he finally saw 3 figures burst from the forest into the landing zone meadow, He immediately began spooling up the helicopter's engines for immediate takeoff. "What happened?" Morrison demanded as the 3 survivors climbed aboard the aircraft. "Where are the others?" "Bear attack!" Rodriguez gasped, still trying to catch his breath. "Massive Kodiak. Stone and Morales are down. Thompson's injured. We need immediate evacuation to Kodiak Regional Hospital and search and rescue backup." Morrison was already lifting off before Rodriguez finished his report. The helicopter climbed rapidly away from the forest, and Morrison immediately began transmitting emergency calls to the Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, and Kodiak Island Emergency Services. Within minutes, a major search and rescue operation was being coordinated from multiple agencies. As the helicopter flew toward Kodiak, the 3 survivors tried to process what had just happened. Walsh, despite her military combat experience, was shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to wear off. Chen stared out the window at the forest below, wondering if their colleagues were still alive and if they would ever see them again. Rodriguez was coordinating with emergency services via radio, providing detailed information about the location and nature of the incident. "Be advised, we have a confirmed bear attack with multiple casualties. Suspect animal is a mature male Kodiak brown bear, estimated weight over 1,200 pounds. Animal is wounded, but still active in the area. Approaching personnel should consider the animal extremely dangerous." The response from Kodiak Emergency Services was immediate and comprehensive. Within 2 hours, a team of Alaska State Troopers, fish and wildlife officers, and paramedics was assembled for a rescue mission. The operation would require multiple helicopters, armed personnel trained in large predator encounters, and medical equipment capable of treating severe trauma injuries in remote wilderness conditions. But even as the rescue operation was being organized, the survivors knew that time was running out for their fallen colleagues. Stone and Morales had been critically injured, and without immediate medical attention, their chances of survival were diminishing with each passing hour. The harsh reality of wilderness rescue operations was that sometimes help arrived too late, and the Alaskan wilderness claimed more victims. The helicopter touched down at Kodiak Regional Hospital 45 minutes after the attack, where a full trauma team was waiting to treat the survivors' injuries. While Chen had escaped with only minor cuts and bruises, Walsh and Rodriguez had sustained more significant injuries during their flight through the forest. Walsh's left wrist was fractured, and Rodriguez had deep lacerations across his arms and chest from forcing his way through dense undergrowth. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the hospital's emergency department director and Jake Morrison's younger sister, took charge of treating the survivors while simultaneously coordinating with the search and rescue teams preparing to return to the crash site. Dr. Morrison had treated numerous bear attack victims during her 12 years in Alaska, and she understood better than most the severity of injuries that could be inflicted by large predators. "The next 24 hours are critical," she told Rodriguez as she cleaned and sutured his wounds. "If your people are still alive, we need to get them here quickly. The human body can only endure so much trauma before irreversible damage occurs." Meanwhile, at the Alaska State Troopers headquarters in Kodiak, Sergeant William Hayes was assembling a response team for what was being classified as a Priority 1 emergency rescue mission. Hayes, a 15-year veteran of law enforcement in Alaska, had dealt with numerous wildlife encounters, but the scale and severity of this incident was unusual, even by Alaskan standards. "We're dealing with a wounded predator that has already claimed territory and established dominance," Hayes briefed his team. "Standard protocols apply, but everyone needs to understand that this animal has already demonstrated his willingness to attack humans. If we encounter the bear, our primary concern is human safety, not wildlife preservation." The rescue team included 4 state troopers, 2 fish and wildlife officers, and a 3-person medical team from Kodiak Regional Hospital. Each team member was armed with high-powered rifles chambered for .375H and H Magnum cartridges, ammunition specifically designed for large and dangerous game. Additionally, the team carried specialized medical equipment, including portable stretchers, trauma supplies, and equipment for establishing emergency landing zones for helicopter evacuation. As the rescue helicopters prepared to depart Kodiak, weather conditions were beginning to deteriorate. A storm front was moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, bringing high winds and reduced visibility that would make flying conditions extremely hazardous. The rescue operation was facing a rapidly closing weather window that might prevent access to the crash site for several days. Pilot Jake Morrison, despite his exhaustion from the earlier flight, volunteered to lead the rescue helicopters back to Shuyak Island. His intimate knowledge of the terrain and weather patterns in the area made him the logical choice, but the stress of knowing that his passengers' colleagues were depending on his flying skills weighed heavily on his mind. "We've got maybe 3 hours of flyable weather before this storm hits," Morrison told Hayes as they prepared for takeoff. "If we don't find them in that window, we might not get another chance for 72 hours or more." The rescue helicopters, 2 Bell 212s loaded with personnel and equipment, lifted off from Kodiak at 13:47 hours, racing against both time and weather to reach the remote crash site. The flight to Shuyak Island took slightly longer than the morning mission, due to increasingly turbulent air conditions and reduced visibility from approaching storm clouds. As they neared the island, Morrison attempted to radio ahead to the original crash site, hoping against hope that some of the missing firefighters might be able to respond. The radio remained silent, except for the static of atmospheric interference from the approaching storm system. The first helicopter, carrying Hayes and his tactical team, landed in the same meadow that had served as the morning insertion point. The area looked different now, with the afternoon light filtering through storm clouds and casting ominous shadows across the landscape. The silence was profound and somehow threatening, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Hayes deployed his team in a tactical formation designed for high-risk wildlife encounters. 2 officers with high-powered rifles took point positions, while the medical team remained in a protected position near the helicopter. Fish and wildlife officers flanked the formation, using their expertise in animal behavior to watch for signs of the bear's presence. The approach to the crash site was conducted with extreme caution, the team moving slowly through the dense forest while maintaining constant communication and watching for any signs of movement in the underbrush. Every few minutes, they would stop and listen carefully, hoping to hear calls for help from the missing firefighters. 20 minutes into their approach march, Officer Janet Chen, no relation to firefighter Sarah Chen, spotted the first evidence of the earlier battle. "Blood trail here," she called out quietly, pointing to dark stains on fallen leaves and disturbed earth. "Looks like someone was dragged through this area." The blood trail led deeper into the forest, away from both the crash site and the helicopter landing zone. Hayes made the decision to follow the trail while maintaining radio contact with the helicopter crews, hoping it would lead them to survivors, but fearing what they might actually find. The trail led to a small clearing, approximately 100 yards from the aircraft wreckage, and what they found there would haunt the rescue team members for years to come. Thompson's body was partially concealed under a pile of brush and forest debris, clearly placed there by the bear as a food cache for later consumption. The massive predator had dragged the injured firefighter away from the crash site and killed him, then covered the body in typical bear behavior for preserving food sources. "We have one confirmed fatality," Hayes radioed back to the helicopters grimly, still searching for the other 2 missing personnel. The search for Stone and Morales continued for another hour, with the rescue team systematically checking the area around the crash site and following every possible trail and sign of disturbance in the forest. The approaching storm was making their work increasingly difficult, with wind beginning to shake the trees and the first drops of rain starting to fall. Officer Mike Patterson, using a trained search dog borrowed from the Anchorage Police Department, finally picked up a scent trail leading toward a dense thicket of alder bushes near a small stream. The dog's behavior indicated that the scent was recent and strong, suggesting that either survivors or additional remains were located in that direction. What they found was Stone, unconscious but still alive after nearly 6 hours in the wilderness with severe injuries. She had managed to crawl approximately 50 yards from the site of the attack before collapsing from blood loss and trauma. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her skin had the pale, clammy appearance of someone in advanced shock. The medical team immediately went to work, establishing IV lines and beginning fluid resuscitation while assessing the extent of her injuries. Her left shoulder and arm had suffered massive trauma from the bear's bite, with compound fractures and extensive tissue damage that would require immediate surgical intervention. Additionally, she had lost a significant amount of blood and was hypothermic from prolonged exposure to the cool mountain air. "We need to get her to a hospital immediately," announced paramedic Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to Fire Captain Rodriguez. "She's stable for transport, but she needs surgery within the next 2 hours if we're going to save the arm." As the medical team prepared Stone for helicopter evacuation, the search continued for Morales. Time was running out, both for any potential survivor and for the rescue operation itself, as the storm conditions were rapidly approaching the limits for safe helicopter operations. It was Officer Chen who finally located Morales, and what she found defied all expectations. The firefighter was not only alive but conscious, having managed to find shelter in a small cave formed by fallen boulders near the crash site. He had suffered significant injuries in his initial encounter with the bear, including a broken left arm and deep lacerations to his scalp and face, but he had retained enough presence of mind to seek shelter and attempt basic first aid on himself. "Thank God you found me," Morales whispered as the medical team reached him. "I thought I was going to die out here." That bear. I've never seen anything so big and angry in my life. Morales' survival was particularly remarkable given that he had been knocked unconscious during the initial attack and had awakened to find himself abandoned by his colleagues in their desperate flight to safety. Rather than panicking, he had used his firefighting training to assess his situation rationally and take appropriate survival actions. "I knew you guys would come back for us," he told Hayes, as the rescue team prepared him for evacuation. "I just had to stay alive long enough for you to find me." The helicopter evacuation of both survivors was completed just as the storm conditions deteriorated beyond safe flying limits. Morrison's exceptional piloting skills were tested to their limits as he navigated through increasingly turbulent air and reduced visibility, but he successfully delivered both injured firefighters to Kodiak Regional Hospital. The medical team at the hospital worked through the night to save Stone's mangled arm and treat both survivors' extensive injuries. Stone required 7 hours of reconstructive surgery to repair the damage to her shoulder and upper arm, while Morales underwent surgery to repair his fractured bones and clean the infected lacerations on his scalp and face. Both firefighters would survive their ordeal, though Stone would face a long and difficult recovery process that would ultimately end her firefighting career. The psychological trauma of the attack would affect both survivors for months to come, requiring extensive counseling and therapy to help them process the horrific experience. The recovery of Thompson's remains required a second rescue mission 3 days later, after the storm had passed and flying conditions had improved. The Alaska Fish and Wildlife Service insisted on conducting the recovery operation with armed escorts, as the bear remained in the area and was still considered extremely dangerous. When the recovery team reached Thompson's body, they found evidence that the bear had returned multiple times to feed, confirming wildlife experts' assessments that the animal had claimed the crash site as his territory. The massive predator had established a pattern of behavior that made him a continuing threat to any humans who might venture into the area. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Alaska's state wildlife biologist, no relation to firefighter Amy Walsh, was brought in to assess the bear's behavior and make recommendations for managing the ongoing threat. Her analysis of the evidence at the crash site painted a picture of an unusually aggressive and territorial animal whose behavior had been modified by his encounter with humans. This bear has now associated humans with both food sources and territorial threats, Dr. Walsh explained to state officials. His behavior pattern suggests that he will continue to defend this area aggressively and may actively hunt humans who enter his claimed territory. The decision was made to authorize lethal removal of the bear, both for public safety reasons and to prevent the animal from teaching aggressive, anti-human behaviors to other bears in the area. A specialized hunting team was assembled, consisting of experienced guides and wildlife officers, armed with heavy rifles capable of reliably stopping a large and dangerous bear. The hunt for the killer bear lasted 6 days and required the tracking skills of some of Alaska's most experienced guides. The animal had retreated deeper into the island's interior after the human intrusions into his territory. But his massive size and the wounds he had sustained during the firefighter attack made him relatively easy to track through the dense forest. Master Guide Robert Harrison, no relation to the dead pilot, finally located the bear in a remote valley nearly 10 miles from the original crash site. The animal was noticeably weakened by his injuries, but remained extremely dangerous, charging the hunting party when they approached within 100 yards of his position. Harrison's first shot, a .416 Rigby solid bullet to the chest, dropped the massive bear, but did not kill him immediately. The animal continued to struggle and attempt to reach his attackers, requiring 3 additional shots before he finally succumbed to his wounds. The bear's body measurements confirmed the rescue team's estimates of his extraordinary size. He weighed 1,347 pounds and measured 11 feet, 4 inches from nose to tail. His skull measurements placed him among the largest Kodiak bears ever recorded, and his age was estimated at 15 to 17 years, making him a fully mature dominant male in his prime. Wildlife biologists conducted a complete necropsy on the bear's carcass, documenting the extent of injuries he had sustained during his encounters with the firefighters. The animal had absorbed 13 pistol bullets, most of which had failed to penetrate deeply enough to cause immediately fatal damage. The bear's incredible toughness and determination had allowed him to continue fighting and claiming territory despite wounds that would have been fatal to most animals. The investigation into the incident was conducted by multiple agencies, including the Alaska State Troopers, the National Transportation Safety Board, and the Alaska Department of Fish and Wildlife. The investigation focused on both the aircraft accident that had initiated the chain of events and the bear attack that had claimed 1 life and seriously injured 2 others. The NTSB investigation determined that pilot Robert Harrison had suffered a fatal heart attack while flying, causing him to lose control of the aircraft during his approach to Kodiak. The Cessna had impacted the forest at high speed, killing Harrison instantly and creating the fire that had initially attracted the bear to the crash site. The wildlife investigation concluded that the bear's aggressive behavior was consistent with normal territorial responses of mature male Kodiak bears, but had been amplified by several factors, including the unusual circumstances of the aircraft crash, the presence of a human fatality that provided a food source, and the bear's perception of the crash site as part of his established territory. This was essentially a perfect storm of circumstances that led to a tragic but predictable outcome, explained Dr. Walsh in her official report. The bear was simply behaving according to his natural instincts in defending what he perceived as his territory and food sources. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of firefighting and rescue protocols for operations in known bear country. New procedures were implemented requiring armed escorts for all wilderness operations, improved communications equipment, and enhanced training for all personnel who might encounter large predators during emergency response operations. Fire Captain Marcus Rodriguez returned to duty 3 months after the incident, but the psychological impact of losing Thompson and nearly losing Stone and Morales weighed heavily on his mind. He underwent extensive counseling through the department's Employee Assistance Program and eventually transferred to a desk job in fire prevention and education. "I replay that decision to abandon equipment and retreat every single day," Rodriguez told department psychologist Dr. Karen Phillips during one of their sessions. "Part of me wonders if we could have saved Thompson if we'd fought harder or made different choices." Dr. Phillips worked with Rodriguez and the other survivors to help them understand that their survival decisions had been appropriate under the circumstances and that Thompson's death was a tragic consequence of an extremely dangerous situation that no amount of training could have fully prepared them for. Sarah Chen returned to active firefighting duty but requested a transfer to urban operations, unable to face the psychological challenges of wilderness rescue work after her traumatic experience. Her performance evaluations remained excellent, but her colleagues noted that she had lost some of her previous enthusiasm for high-risk emergency response operations. Amy Walsh's recovery was complicated by the intersection of her military combat experience and the bear attack trauma. The incident had triggered post-traumatic stress responses related to her service in Afghanistan, and she required specialized therapy to address both the military trauma and the wilderness attack. "The bear attack brought back all the helplessness and chaos I thought I had worked through from my deployment," Walsh explained to her therapist. "It's like my brain couldn't separate the two experiences, and I was reliving both of them simultaneously." Rebecca Stone's physical recovery took nearly 2 years and required multiple surgeries to reconstruct her damaged shoulder and arm. Despite the extensive medical treatment, she never regained full use of her left arm and was forced to accept medical retirement from the fire department. Stone channeled her experience into advocacy for improved wilderness safety protocols and became a sought-after speaker on bear safety and wilderness survival. Her presentations to firefighting and rescue organizations throughout Alaska helped prevent similar incidents by educating emergency responders about the realities of operating in predator country. "People need to understand that we're visitors in their world, not the other way around," Stone would tell her audiences. "Respect for the wildlife and their territory isn't just good environmental policy, it's a survival necessity." Daniel Morales made a complete physical recovery from his injuries and eventually returned to firefighting duty, though he never again volunteered for wilderness rescue operations. His experience surviving alone in the forest for 6 hours became legendary within the department, and he became an instructor in wilderness survival techniques for emergency responders. The equipment abandoned at the crash site, valued at over $150,000, was eventually recovered by a specialized team several months later. Much of it had been damaged by weather exposure and wildlife activity, with the bear having apparently investigated and destroyed several pieces of electronic equipment. The incident became a case study in wilderness emergency response protocols and was analyzed by firefighting and rescue organizations throughout North America. The combination of aircraft accident investigation, wildlife behavior analysis, and emergency response evaluation provided valuable lessons for improving safety procedures in remote wilderness areas. Jake Morrison continued flying rescue missions throughout Alaska, but the incident affected him deeply. He had flown emergency response missions for over 15 years without losing passengers, and the knowledge that his decision to drop off the firefighting crew had contributed to the tragic outcome weighed heavily on his conscience. You make split-second decisions based on the best information available at the time, Morrison reflected during a debriefing session with his supervisor. But when those decisions contribute to someone's death, it's hard to find peace with that, even when you know you followed all the correct procedures. Morrison underwent additional training in wildlife threat assessment and began carrying enhanced communications equipment to maintain better contact with ground crews during wilderness operations. He also became an advocate for improved coordination between aviation assets and ground personnel during high-risk rescue missions. The families of the firefighters involved in the incident received extensive support from the Kodiak Fire Department and the broader firefighting community throughout Alaska. Thompson's widow, Maria, and their 2 young children were provided with full benefits and ongoing support, while the injured firefighters received comprehensive medical care and rehabilitation services. Maria Thompson filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Alaska Department of Fish and Wildlife, alleging that the state had failed to adequately warn emergency responders about the presence of dangerous wildlife in the area. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with the state agreeing to implement enhanced wildlife notification procedures for emergency response operations. The incident also prompted changes in wildlife management policies throughout Alaska. New protocols were established for monitoring and managing bears that had been involved in encounters with humans, and enhanced communication systems were implemented to share wildlife activity information with emergency response agencies. Dr. Jennifer Walsh led the development of new guidelines for assessing bear behavior and threat levels, creating a standardized system for evaluating when bears pose sufficient danger to justify lethal removal. The guidelines helped wildlife managers make more consistent and scientifically sound decisions about managing problem bears. Every bear-human encounter is unique, but we can identify patterns of behavior that indicate escalating threat levels, Dr. Walsh explained in her training materials for wildlife officers. The key is early recognition of problematic behaviors and appropriate intervention before tragic incidents occur. The crash site on Shuyak Island was eventually cleaned up by environmental specialists, with the aircraft wreckage removed and the area restored to its natural state. A small memorial plaque was installed near the site, commemorating both pilot Robert Harrison and firefighter James Thompson, whose deaths had resulted from the tragic chain of events. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for firefighters and aviators throughout Alaska, serving as a reminder of the risks faced by emergency responders and the unpredictable dangers of operating in Alaska's wilderness. Annual memorial services were held at the site, with participants flying in by helicopter to pay their respects. The psychological impact of the incident extended beyond the immediate participants to the broader firefighting and emergency response community throughout Alaska. The knowledge that a routine rescue mission had resulted in such devastating consequences forced a re-evaluation of risk assessment procedures and safety protocols. Fire Chief William Peterson implemented a comprehensive review of all department procedures for wilderness operations, bringing in outside experts to evaluate training programs, equipment specifications, and operational protocols. The review resulted in significant changes to how the department approached high-risk rescue missions. We have a responsibility to our firefighters to provide them with the best possible training and equipment for the dangerous situations they face, Chief Peterson announced during a department meeting following the incident. This tragedy has shown us areas where we can improve, and we owe it to Thompson's memory and to our current personnel to make those improvements. The training program was completely overhauled, with enhanced instruction in wildlife behavior, wilderness survival, and threat assessment. All personnel were required to complete advanced bear safety courses, and new equipment standards were implemented, including more powerful firearms and improved communication devices. The incident also had broader implications for emergency response operations throughout Alaska and other wilderness areas of North America. The detailed analysis of what went wrong and how it might have been prevented became required reading for emergency responders from Canada to California. Dr. Michael Patterson, a researcher at the University of Alaska's Institute of Arctic Biology, used the incident as the basis for a comprehensive study of human-bear conflicts in emergency response situations. His research identified key factors that contributed to dangerous encounters and developed recommendations for reducing risk during wilderness operations. The Shuyak Island incident represents a confluence of factors that created an extremely dangerous situation, Dr. Patterson concluded in his research paper. While some of those factors were unforeseeable and uncontrollable, others could have been mitigated through better planning, equipment, and training. Patterson's research contributed to the development of new safety protocols that were adopted by emergency response agencies throughout Alaska and other areas with large predator populations. The protocols emphasized the importance of threat assessment, proper equipment, and tactical procedures for operating in predator country. The media coverage of the incident was extensive, with news organizations throughout Alaska and the continental United States reporting on the dramatic bear attack and rescue operation. The story captured public attention partly because of its dramatic nature and partly because it highlighted the unique dangers faced by emergency responders in Alaska. Television documentaries were produced about the incident, featuring interviews with survivors and experts in wildlife behavior and emergency response. The documentaries helped educate the public about the realities of operating in Alaska's wilderness and the risks faced by firefighters and other emergency personnel. However, some of the media coverage was criticized for sensationalizing the incident and portraying the bear as a monster rather than a wild animal behaving according to its natural instincts. Wildlife advocates argued that the coverage could contribute to negative attitudes toward bears and potentially harmful policies regarding wildlife management. Conservation organizations used the incident to highlight the importance of coexistence between humans and wildlife, emphasizing that encounters like the Shuyak Island attack were rare and usually resulted from unusual circumstances rather than typical bear behavior. Bears are not monsters, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, director of the Alaska Bear Conservation Foundation. This was a tragic incident, but it's important to remember that millions of people live and work in bear country without experiencing attacks. The key is education, preparation, and respect for wildlife. The incident also sparked debates about wilderness access and development policies in Alaska. Some argued that areas with high concentrations of large predators should be restricted or require special permits for access, while others maintained that proper education and preparation could allow safe coexistence. Alaska Governor Michael Dunleavy appointed a special commission to study the incident and make recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The commission included representatives from emergency services, wildlife management, aviation, and public safety organizations. The Commission's final report included 37 specific recommendations for improving safety during wilderness emergency operations. Key recommendations included mandatory wildlife threat briefings for all wilderness missions, enhanced communication equipment requirements, and standardized protocols for operating in known predator areas. The loss of life in this incident was tragic but not unavoidable, the Commission concluded. Implementation of appropriate safety measures and protocols can significantly reduce the risk of similar incidents while still allowing emergency responders to carry out their vital missions. Many of the Commission's recommendations were implemented through legislative action and regulatory changes, creating new requirements for emergency response agencies operating in wilderness areas throughout Alaska. The changes were seen as a positive outcome from the tragic incident, potentially preventing future losses. 5 years after the incident, a comprehensive follow-up study was conducted to evaluate the effectiveness of the safety improvements that had been implemented. The study found that while wildlife encounters during emergency operations continued to occur, the severity and frequency of dangerous incidents had decreased significantly. The improvements in training, equipment, and procedures have made a real difference, reported Dr. Lisa Chang, who led the follow-up study. Emergency responders are better prepared to assess and manage wildlife risks, and we've seen a corresponding reduction in serious incidents. The study also found that the psychological support services implemented after the Shuyak Island incident had been effective in helping emergency responders cope with traumatic experiences. The availability of counseling and peer support programs had reduced the long-term impact of wildlife encounters on personnel. However, the study also noted that complacency remained a concern, as newer personnel who had not experienced serious wildlife encounters sometimes failed to take safety protocols seriously. Ongoing education and training were identified as critical components of maintaining safety improvements. The legacy of the Shuyak Island bear attack continues to influence emergency response operations throughout Alaska and other wilderness areas. The incident serves as a stark reminder of the dangers faced by emergency responders and the importance of proper preparation and respect for wildlife. The annual memorial service for James Thompson and Robert Harrison has become an important event for the emergency response community, providing an opportunity to honor their sacrifice and renew commitments to safety and professional excellence. Family members, colleagues, and friends gather each year to remember the men who died and to support those who survived the traumatic experience. Rebecca Stone, despite her career-ending injuries, continues to serve the firefighting community through her safety advocacy work. Her presentations and training programs have reached thousands of emergency responders throughout North America, sharing the hard-learned lessons from her traumatic experience. Every time I tell this story, I hope it prevents someone else from going through what we went through, Stone explains. If sharing our experience saves even one life, then something positive has come from that terrible day. The crash site on Shuyak Island has returned to its natural state, with the forest slowly reclaiming the area where the tragic events unfolded. Wildlife surveys indicate that bear populations in the area remain stable, and the removal of the aggressive male has not had significant impact on the overall ecosystem. New safety protocols require that all emergency response missions to remote wilderness areas include wildlife threat assessments and appropriate precautions. The protocols have been adopted by agencies throughout Alaska and have served as models for similar procedures in other states and provinces with large predator populations. The incident remains a subject of study in emergency response training programs, wildlife management courses, and aviation safety curricula. The detailed analysis of what went wrong and how it could have been prevented continues to provide valuable lessons for professionals working in high-risk wilderness environments. Sarah Chen, now a fire prevention specialist with the Kodiak Fire Department, still thinks about the incident regularly and the role that chance played in determining who survived and who didn't. Her work in fire prevention and education allows her to contribute to public safety while avoiding the high-risk wilderness operations that she can no longer psychologically handle. "We were just doing our jobs, responding to what seemed like a routine call," Chen reflects. "None of us could have anticipated how quickly everything would go wrong." It's a reminder that in emergency response work, you're always just one decision away from disaster. Amy Walsh returned to active duty, but eventually left firefighting to become a counselor, specializing in helping first responders deal with traumatic experiences. Her unique combination of military combat experience and civilian emergency response trauma has made her particularly effective at helping personnel process difficult experiences. Trauma is trauma, whether it comes from combat, natural disasters, or wildlife attacks, Walsh explains to her clients. The important thing is recognizing that these experiences change you, and that's okay. The goal isn't to go back to who you were before, but to integrate the experience and move forward. Daniel Morales completed his recovery and returned to firefighting. But his experience surviving alone in the wilderness gave him a new perspective on emergency preparedness and risk assessment. He became an instructor in wilderness survival and has trained hundreds of emergency responders in the techniques that helped him survive. "The 6 hours I spent alone in that forest after the attack were the longest of my life," Morales recalls, "but they taught me that survival is as much about mental toughness as it is about physical preparation. You have to keep thinking, keep problem solving, even when everything seems hopeless." Marcus Rodriguez eventually returned to active firefighting duty, but was promoted to deputy chief with primary responsibility for training and safety programs. His experience during the Shuyak Island incident made him a passionate advocate for comprehensive emergency response training and proper risk assessment procedures. Leadership means making decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure, Rodriguez explains to new officers. Sometimes those decisions have tragic consequences, even when they're the right decisions based on the information available at the time. Living with that responsibility is part of the job. The equipment abandoned during the retreat from the bear attack was eventually recovered, though much of it was damaged beyond repair by weather and wildlife. The incident led to new procedures for equipment abandonment during emergency situations, with standardized protocols for documenting and recovering abandoned gear. Jake Morrison continued flying rescue missions until his retirement in 2029, but the Shuyak Island incident remained the most difficult experience of his aviation career. His expertise in mountain flying and wilderness operations made him invaluable for training new pilots, and he became an instructor specializing in emergency response aviation. Flying rescue missions in Alaska means accepting that sometimes you can't save everyone, Morrison tells his students. The key is making sure that your decisions and actions give people the best possible chance of survival, even when the outcome isn't what you hoped for. The families of those involved in the incident have found different ways of coping with their experiences. Maria Thompson, James's widow, became active in supporting families of fallen firefighters and worked with the department to improve family support services for emergency responders. The children of the deceased and injured firefighters have grown up knowing their fathers as heroes who risked their lives to help others. Several have expressed interest in careers in emergency services, though their mothers have mixed feelings about continuing the family tradition of high-risk public service. The Shuyak Island bear attack of 2024 remains one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed wildlife encounters in Alaskan history. The incident has contributed to significant improvements in emergency response safety protocols and has enhanced understanding of bear behavior in human-wildlife conflicts. 10 years after the incident, the emergency response community continues to honor the memory of James Thompson and Robert Harrison while working to prevent similar tragedies. The lessons learned from their deaths have undoubtedly saved lives and will continue to do so for generations of emergency responders who work in Alaska's magnificent but dangerous wilderness. The story of the Shuyak Island incident serves as a powerful reminder of the thin line between heroism and tragedy that emergency responders walk every day. It illustrates the unpredictable nature of wilderness rescue operations and the importance of constant vigilance, proper training, and respect for the natural world in which these brave men and women carry out their life-saving missions. As Alaska continues to develop and more people venture into its wilderness areas, the potential for human-wildlife conflicts remains a constant concern. The protocols and procedures developed in response to the Shuyak Island incident provide a framework for managing these risks, but they also underscore the reality that operating in bear country will always involve inherent dangers that cannot be completely eliminated. The legacy of James Thompson and Robert Harrison lives on in the improved safety measures that protect today's emergency responders, and their sacrifice serves as a constant reminder of the courage and dedication required of those who choose to serve others in the world's most challenging environments. Their story continues to inspire and educate new generations of firefighters, paramedics, pilots, and other emergency personnel who carry on the vital work of saving lives in Alaska's vast and unforgiving wilderness. The next stories. White Death at Resolute Bay. The Arctic wind howled across the barren landscape of Resolute Bay, Nunavut, carrying with it the promise of death. Dr. John Turner pulled his parka tighter as he stepped out of the helicopter, the rotors still spinning overhead, kicking up a whirlwind of snow and ice crystals that stung his exposed cheeks. The research station loomed before him like a metallic island in an ocean of white, its angular structure a stark contrast to the endless expanse of tundra that stretched to every horizon. "Welcome to the end of the world!" shouted the pilot Marcus Reed over the mechanical thunder. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with deep lines carved by decades of Arctic flying etched around his pale blue eyes. "You sure about this, Doc? Next pickup isn't for 3 months?" John nodded grimly, shouldering his heavy pack. Behind him, his wife Rachel Turner emerged from the aircraft, her breath forming instant clouds in the -40 air. At 34, she was a brilliant climatologist whose expertise in polar ice formations had earned her recognition worldwide. Her auburn hair was completely hidden beneath a thick wool cap, but her emerald eyes sparkled with the excitement of finally reaching their destination. "This is exactly what we came for," she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Complete isolation, pristine data collection environment, and 3 months to conduct the most comprehensive ice core analysis ever attempted in this region." The third passenger, Dr. David Chen, stumbled slightly as his boots hit the frozen ground. At 28, he was the youngest member of their research team, a data analyst whose expertise in Arctic wildlife behavior patterns had been specifically requested for this expedition. His thick-rimmed glasses were already fogging despite his attempts to keep them clear. "The weather report shows a massive storm system moving in from the northwest," Marcus warned, beginning to unload their supplies from the helicopter's cargo hold. "Could be here within 72 hours. You folks better get settled fast." The Polar Research Station Alpha 7 had been constructed just 18 months earlier, representing a $2 million investment by the Canadian Arctic Research Consortium. The building was designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, with reinforced walls, triple-paned windows, and a heating system capable of maintaining comfortable temperatures even when the outside air reached deadly extremes. The structure consisted of 3 main sections: the primary laboratory and living quarters, a secondary storage and communications building, and a smaller emergency shelter designed to serve as a backup in case of catastrophic system failures. As the helicopter's rotors gradually wound down, an oppressive silence settled over the landscape. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to have weight pressing down on them from the vast, empty sky above. The only sounds were their own breathing and the occasional crack of ice shifting somewhere in the distance. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Rachel whispered, her voice filled with awe as she gazed out at the endless white wilderness. "It's like standing on another planet." John nodded, though something about the silence made him uneasy. He had spent considerable time in remote locations during his career as a geological survey specialist, but there was something different about this place, something that felt watchful. Marcus finished unloading their equipment and supplies, creating a small mountain of boxes, cases, and containers beside the landing pad. The helicopter had brought enough provisions to last 3 people 4 months, including emergency rations in case weather delayed their pickup. "Radio check is every morning at 0800 hours, Marcus informed them, handing John a detailed communications schedule. "If I don't hear from you for more than 48 hours, I'll assume something's wrong and send a rescue team. Weather permitting, of course." The pilot's expression grew serious as he looked toward the horizon where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "Storm's coming faster than predicted. I need to get airborne in the next 20 minutes, or I'll be stuck here with you." They worked quickly to move their supplies indoors, the bitter cold making every task more difficult than it would have been in normal conditions. By the time the helicopter lifted off, disappearing into the grey sky like a mechanical insect, the 3 researchers were exhausted but excited to begin their work. The interior of the research station was surprisingly comfortable, with modern amenities and well-insulated walls that kept the Arctic cold at bay. The main laboratory was equipped with sophisticated analytical equipment for processing ice core samples, while the living quarters featured 3 separate bedrooms, a common kitchen and dining area, and a communications center with both radio and satellite internet capabilities. "This is incredible," David said, examining the computer systems that would help him analyze wildlife movement patterns in the region. "We have access to real-time satellite imagery, weather data, and even seismic monitoring equipment." Rachel was equally impressed with the laboratory facilities. "We can process samples immediately instead of shipping them south for analysis. This is going to revolutionize our understanding of climate change patterns in this region." As evening approached, they prepared their first meal in the station, a celebratory dinner of freeze-dried beef stew and reconstituted vegetables. The mood was optimistic, filled with enthusiasm for the groundbreaking research they planned to conduct over the next 3 months. "I've been reviewing the wildlife activity reports for this area," David said, consulting his tablet while they ate. "Interestingly, there have been several polar bear sightings within a 50-kilometer radius over the past 6 months. Much higher than historical averages for this time of year." John looked up from his meal with interest. "What's causing the increased activity?" "Climate change, primarily. The sea ice is forming later and breaking up earlier each year, which disrupts their normal hunting patterns. They're having to travel much greater distances to find suitable hunting grounds, and some are moving inland in search of food sources." Rachel frowned. "Are we in any danger?" The station briefing materials mentioned polar bears, but indicated the risk was minimal. David consulted his data again. The construction crew reported one close encounter last summer, but the bear moved on without incident. The station is equipped with bear deterrents, including motion sensors, bright lights, and noisemakers. Plus, the building itself is designed to be bear-resistant. They spent the remainder of the evening familiarizing themselves with the station's systems and planning their research schedule. The heating system maintained a comfortable temperature throughout the building, and the lights provided a warm, welcoming atmosphere that made the harsh environment outside seem distant and manageable. As they prepared for bed, none of them noticed the large tracks that had appeared in the snow near the landing pad, tracks that hadn't been there when the helicopter departed. The prints were massive, each one nearly a foot long and almost as wide, with deep claw marks extending beyond the toe impressions. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the station's lights, a massive polar bear lifted its black nose to the wind, catching the unfamiliar sense of human presence. The animal was enormous, even by polar bear standards, weighing close to 800 pounds and standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder when on all fours. Its fur was yellowed with age and scarred from countless battles with other bears and the harsh Arctic environment. This particular bear had been wandering for weeks, driven by hunger and the unusual weather patterns that had disrupted its normal hunting grounds. The sea ice that should have provided access to seals had formed much later than usual, forcing the bear to search inland for sustenance. It had already been 3 days since its last meal, a small Arctic fox that had done little to satisfy its massive appetite. The bear's keen sense of smell, hundreds of times more sensitive than a human's, had detected the research station from more than 5 kilometers away. The sense of cooked food, human sweat, and unfamiliar chemical odors from the laboratory equipment created an intriguing mixture that drew the predator closer to investigate. Moving with surprising silence for such a massive creature, the bear approached the station under cover of darkness. Its pale fur provided perfect camouflage against the snow, making it virtually invisible as it circled the building, searching for weaknesses in its defenses. The motion sensors detected the bear's presence multiple times during the night, triggering bright floodlights and automated noisemakers designed to frighten away curious wildlife. Each time, the bear retreated to the edge of the light's reach, waiting patiently until the systems reset themselves before moving closer again. Inside the station, the 3 researchers slept soundly, unaware that they were being stalked by one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators. The building's excellent insulation prevented them from hearing the bear's movements outside, and the automated deterrent systems were designed to operate without disturbing the station's occupants. The first morning dawned clear and brutally cold, with temperatures reaching -43 degrees Celsius. John was the first to wake, rising before dawn, to begin the daily routine of checking weather conditions and establishing radio contact with the outside world. As he made coffee in the station's well-equipped kitchen, he noticed something unusual through the window facing the landing pad. The snow appeared disturbed, with what looked like large impressions scattered across the area where they had unloaded supplies the previous day. "Rachel, David, you need to see this," he called, his voice carrying a note of concern that brought his colleagues quickly to the window. The tracks were unmistakable once they knew what to look for. Large, rounded paw prints with visible claw marks, creating a clear trail that circled the entire research station before disappearing into the tundra beyond. "Polar bear," David confirmed, his voice tight with apprehension. "A big one, based on the size of those prints. Must have visited during the night." Rachel pulled her robe tighter around herself as she studied the tracks. "How close did it get to the building?" "Very close," John replied, pointing to a set of prints that came within 3 meters of the main entrance. "These tracks go right up to the door." They spent the morning reviewing the station's security footage, which clearly showed the massive bear's nocturnal visit. The animal had spent nearly 2 hours circling the building, testing the motion sensors and studying the structure with obvious intelligence. "Look at this," David said, pointing to a section of video where the bear appeared to be examining the door handle. "It's trying to figure out how to get inside." The sight of the enormous predator so close to their shelter was deeply unsettling, but they reminded themselves that the station had been designed specifically to prevent such intrusions. The doors were reinforced steel with heavy-duty locks, the windows were thick and placed too high for even a large bear to reach, and the walls were constructed with materials specifically chosen to resist animal attacks. "We should report this to the research consortium," Rachel suggested. "They need to know we have an active polar bear in the immediate area." John attempted to establish radio contact with the outside world, but atmospheric conditions were preventing clear transmission. The approaching storm system was already interfering with radio waves, creating static that made communication nearly impossible. "We'll try again this afternoon," he decided. "The weather should clear up enough for better reception." They decided to proceed with their research plans despite the bear's presence, reasoning that the station's defenses were adequate protection. Their first task was to establish a collection site for ice core samples, which required them to venture approximately 1 kilometer from the station to reach an area with optimal ice formations. The preparation for their first field expedition took most of the morning. They assembled specialized drilling equipment, sample containers, and emergency supplies, all of which had to be transported on a heavy sled designed for Arctic conditions. Each team member wore multiple layers of protective clothing, including insulated boots rated for extreme cold, wind-resistant outer shells, and emergency beacons that would allow rescue teams to locate them if they became separated from the station. "Remember, we stay together at all times," John emphasized as they prepared to venture outside. "If we encounter the bear, we do not run. We make ourselves appear large, make noise, and back away slowly." The wind had picked up significantly since morning, creating a wind chill that made the already brutal temperature feel even more dangerous. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes under these conditions, making every task potentially life-threatening if not performed with extreme caution. As they opened the station's main door, a blast of Arctic air flooded the interior, instantly dropping the internal temperature by several degrees. The contrast between the warm, comfortable interior and the harsh environment outside was jarring, serving as a stark reminder of how dependent we were on the station's protection. The journey to the collection site was difficult but uneventful. The sled loaded with equipment was heavy and awkward to maneuver across the uneven snow, requiring all 3 team members to work together to navigate around obstacles and maintain their heading. The GPS navigation system they relied on worked perfectly, guiding them to the predetermined coordinates where previous surveys had identified optimal ice conditions. The drilling process itself was time-consuming and physically demanding. The specialized equipment required precise operation to extract core samples without damaging the delicate ice structures they hoped to analyze. Each sample had to be carefully labeled, photographed, and stored in temperature-controlled containers that would preserve the ice's molecular structure during transport back to the laboratory. "These formations are incredible," Rachel said, her voice muffled by the thick scarf wrapped around her face. "Some of these ice layers could be thousands of years old. The climate data locked in here will be invaluable." David was busy documenting the site with photographs and detailed measurements, creating a comprehensive record that would allow them to locate the exact same position for follow-up sampling in the future. His thick gloves made operating the camera equipment challenging, but he managed to capture detailed images of each sample and the surrounding area. As they worked, none of them noticed the distant figure watching from a ridge approximately 2 kilometers to the north. The polar bear had been tracking their scent since they left the station, following at a safe distance while observing their activities. The animal's exceptional eyesight allowed it to monitor their movements, even from such a great distance, and its experience hunting seals had taught it the value of patience when stalking prey. The return journey to the station took nearly 3 hours as the temperature continued to drop and the wind increased to dangerous levels. By the time they reached the building, all three researchers were exhausted and nearly frozen despite their protective clothing. "I've never been so happy to see a building in my life," David said as they stumbled through the entrance, their equipment clattering behind them on the sled. The warmth inside the station felt like a physical embrace after hours in the brutal cold. They spent the next hour warming up, changing into dry clothes, and organizing the ice samples they had collected. The laboratory's environmental controls would maintain the samples at the perfect temperature for analysis while they planned their next collection expedition. As evening approached, they attempted radio contact again, but found conditions had worsened rather than improved. The incoming storm was now clearly visible on the horizon, a massive wall of dark clouds that promised to bring even more severe weather to their isolated location. "Looks like we're going to be completely cut off for the next few days," John observed, studying the weather data displayed on his computer screen. "This storm system is massive, could dump several feet of snow and bring winds over 100 kilometers per hour. Rachel looked concerned as she studied the forecast. "Are we prepared for that kind of weather?" "The station is designed to handle much worse," David assured her, consulting the building's specifications. "Emergency power, backup heating systems, and enough supplies to last for weeks, if necessary." They spent the evening processing their first batch of ice samples, using the sophisticated analytical equipment to begin extracting climate data from the ancient ice. The work was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring precise measurements and careful documentation of every finding. As they worked, the wind outside began to increase noticeably, rattling the building's windows and creating an ominous soundtrack to their activities. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule, bringing with it the promise of several days of complete isolation from the outside world. None of them slept well that night. The increasing wind created a constant background noise that made the building seem less secure than it had the previous evening. Every creak and groan of the structure settling seemed amplified, and the knowledge that a massive polar bear had been investigating their shelter made every sound potentially threatening. The storm struck with full fury just before dawn on their third day at the station. The wind reached sustained speeds of over 90 kilometers per hour, driving snow horizontally across the landscape and reducing visibility to mere meters. The building shook under the assault, but its robust construction proved equal to the challenge. "I can barely see the thermometer outside," Rachel observed, peering through one of the frost-covered windows. "It's completely white out there." The temperature had dropped even further during the night, reaching -48 degrees Celsius before the storm's wind chill made accurate measurement impossible. Under these conditions, exposed human skin would freeze solid within minutes, making any venture outside the station potentially fatal. They settled into a routine of laboratory work and equipment maintenance, using the forced confinement to process more ice samples and analyze their preliminary findings. The data was already revealing fascinating insights into historical climate patterns, confirming some theories while challenging others. These ice formations showed dramatic temperature fluctuations over the past millennium, Rachel explained, pointing to microscopic structures visible under high magnification. Some of the changes were incredibly rapid, occurring over periods of just a few years rather than decades or centuries. David was equally excited about his preliminary data analysis. The satellite imagery shows this region has experienced unprecedented changes over the past 5 years. Traditional wildlife migration patterns have been completely disrupted. As the storm raged outside, they were unaware that they were no longer alone in their immediate vicinity. The polar bear had taken shelter in a natural ice formation approximately 500 meters from the station, a cave-like structure created by wind-carved snowdrifts that provided protection from the worst of the weather. The bear's hunger was becoming desperate. It had now been 4 days since its last substantial meal, and the storm had eliminated any possibility of hunting in its preferred terrain. The constant scent of the humans and their food supplies had become an obsession, drawing the predator ever closer to a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. During brief lulls in the storm, the bear ventured closer to the station, learning more about its construction and the routines of its occupants. The animal's intelligence was considerable, and it had begun to recognize patterns in the human's behavior, noting when lights came on and off, when cooking smells were strongest, and when the building seemed most vulnerable to approach. The second night of the storm brought a temporary reduction in wind speed, though snow continued to fall heavily. Inside the station, the three researchers had grown more comfortable with their situation, their initial anxiety about the bear's presence fading as they became absorbed in their work. "I think we can start planning our next collection expedition," John suggested during dinner. "The weather forecast shows this storm system moving through within the next 24 hours. "We should definitely explore the eastern ridge," Rachel agreed. "The geological surveys indicate some fascinating ice formations in that direction." David was reviewing his wildlife monitoring data when he noticed something unusual. "That's strange. The motion sensors have been triggering more frequently during the past few hours, but there's nothing visible on the security cameras." John frowned as he studied the monitoring system's logs. "Could be the storm causing false alarms. High winds can sometimes trigger the sensors." They decided to investigate the anomaly more thoroughly, reviewing recorded footage from the past several hours. Most of the triggered alerts showed nothing but blowing snow and wind-driven debris, but one clip caught their attention immediately. At approximately 10:30 that evening, the cameras had captured a brief glimpse of something large and pale, moving just at the edge of the floodlight's reach. The image was grainy and partially obscured by blowing snow, but the shape was unmistakably that of a massive polar bear. "It's back," David whispered, his voice tight with apprehension, "and it's gotten much closer than before." They spent the next hour reviewing additional footage, discovering that the bear had been circling the station repeatedly during the storm, approaching closer each time as if testing their defenses. In one particularly unsettling clip, the animal could be seen standing on its hind legs beside one of the windows, its massive paws pressed against the glass as it peered inside. "We need to reinforce our security measures," John decided. "This bear is definitely showing increased aggressive behavior." They spent the remainder of the evening checking door locks, testing the emergency communications equipment, and reviewing their emergency procedures. The station's design included several fail-safe systems, including a reinforced safe room that could be sealed from the inside and equipped with independent communications and life support systems. "If the bear somehow gets inside the main building, we retreat to the safe room immediately," John instructed. "No heroics, no attempts to save equipment or personal belongings. Our lives are more important than any research data." The third night passed without incident, though none of them slept particularly well. Every sound outside seemed potentially threatening, and the knowledge that a massive predator was stalking them made even the station's warm, comfortable interior feel less secure. The storm finally began to subside during the early morning hours of their fourth day, though snow continued to fall and temperatures remained dangerously low. The wind had dropped to manageable levels, and visibility had improved enough to see the immediate surroundings of the station. "Look at all this snow," Rachel observed, amazed by the accumulation that had occurred during the storm. There must be at least 2 meters of new snow cover. The dramatic change in the landscape was immediately apparent. Familiar landmarks had disappeared beneath the snow, and the terrain around the station had been completely reshaped by wind-driven drifts. Navigation would be considerably more challenging until the snow settled, and they could re-establish their reference points. As they prepared breakfast, John noticed something disturbing outside the kitchen window. A section of the station's outer wall showed clear evidence of damage, with deep scratches gouged into the reinforced siding and insulation material scattered in the snow below. "That wasn't there before the storm," he said grimly, pointing out the damage to his colleagues. The scratches were unmistakably claw marks, far too large and deep to have been made by any animal smaller than a polar bear. The pattern suggested the bear had been attempting to tear through the wall itself, testing the building's structural integrity. "We need to contact the research consortium immediately," Rachel said, her voice reflecting the urgency they all felt. "This situation is escalating beyond our ability to handle safely." John attempted to establish radio contact, but found that atmospheric conditions were still preventing clear communication. The storm had passed their immediate area, but interference from the larger weather system made long-range radio transmission nearly impossible. "We'll keep trying throughout the day," he decided. "Someone needs to know what's happening here." As if summoned by their conversation about it, the massive polar bear emerged from the snowdrifts approximately 100 meters from the station's main window. In the clear morning light, its true size was terrifyingly apparent. The animal was enormous, its powerful muscles clearly visible beneath its thick fur, and its movements conveyed a sense of strength that was both beautiful and terrifying. The bear sat back on its haunches and stared directly at the station, as if it were studying the building and its occupants with deliberate intelligence. For nearly 10 minutes, the predator remained motionless, its black eyes fixed on the windows where the humans were watching from inside. "It knows we're in here," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "Look at the way it's watching us." The psychological impact of being observed by such a powerful predator was profound. Even with the protection of the station's walls between them and the bear, all three researchers felt an instinctual fear that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to humanity's most primitive survival instincts. Finally, the bear rose to its feet and began to move closer to the building. Its gait was deliberate and unhurried, conveying a sense of confidence that was deeply unsettling to watch. The animal approached the main entrance and began investigating the door, sniffing along the seams and testing the handle with its massive paws. "The door locks are electronic," John said, more to reassure himself than to inform the others. "Even if it figures out how to operate the handle, it can't get inside without the access code." The bear spent several minutes examining the entrance before moving on to investigate the windows. Standing on its hind legs, the animal was tall enough to reach the lower windows, and it pressed its nose against the glass while peering inside with obvious curiosity. "It's learning about our defenses," David observed with growing alarm. "This isn't random behavior. It's conducting reconnaissance." The bear's investigation of the station continued for more than an hour, during which it examined every possible entry point and tested various components of the building's construction. At one point, the animal discovered the external housing for the heating system's air intake and began digging around it, apparently trying to determine if it represented a vulnerability. "We can't stay here," Rachel said finally. "This bear isn't going to give up and move on. It's committed to getting inside, and it's only a matter of time before it finds a way." John considered their options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. The nearest settlement was more than 200 kilometers away, across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Their radio equipment wasn't functioning properly, making it impossible to call for immediate assistance. The emergency beacon would summon help, but rescue could take days to arrive under current weather conditions. "We could try to reach the emergency cache," he suggested reluctantly. "It's only 15 kilometers south of here, and it's stocked with supplies and a backup radio system." The emergency cache was one of several supply depots maintained by the research consortium for situations exactly like this one. It contained food, medical supplies, emergency shelter materials, and most importantly, a powerful radio transmitter capable of reaching rescue services even under adverse atmospheric conditions. 15 kilometers in these conditions could take us all day, David pointed out, and we'd be completely exposed to the bear if it decided to follow us. As if it had overheard their conversation, the bear suddenly looked up from its investigation of the heating system and stared directly at the window where they were standing. The animal's expression seemed almost thoughtful, as if it were considering its next course of action. Then, without warning, the bear charged. The massive predator covered the distance to the main entrance in seconds, its powerful legs driving it forward with shocking speed. The impact when it collided with the door was tremendous, causing the entire building to shake and setting off every alarm system in the station. Emergency lights began flashing, sirens wailed, and automated voice warnings echoed throughout the building. But the bear seemed undeterred by the noise and confusion. It rose up on its hind legs and began attacking the door with its claws, gouging deep scratches in the reinforced steel and gradually working at the seals around the frame. "Get to the safe room," John shouted over the cacophony of alarms. "Move now!" They grabbed essential supplies and emergency equipment, abandoning their research materials and personal belongings in their haste to reach the secure area. The safe room was located in the center of the building, accessible through a corridor that led away from the main entrance. As they ran through the hallway, the sounds of the bear's assault on the building grew even more violent. The animal had apparently discovered that the door frame was slightly less robust than the door itself, and was concentrating its attacks on the junction points where the frame met the wall. The safe room door was solid steel, designed to withstand extreme conditions and equipped with multiple locking mechanisms. Once inside, they would have access to emergency communications, backup power, and enough supplies to survive for several days if necessary. But as John reached for the safe room's access panel, the building's main alarm system suddenly went silent. The emergency lights continued to flash, but the sirens and warning announcements stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of their own breathing and the bear's continued assault on the main entrance. "Power failure," David said, checking the status indicators on his equipment. "The bear must have damaged something critical." Without power to the electronic locks, the safe room's door would not open. The manual override required a key that was kept in the main office, back toward the area where the bear was trying to break in. "We're trapped," Rachel whispered, the reality of their situation finally hitting home. "If the bear gets through that door, we have nowhere to go." The building shuddered again as the bear renewed its attack with even greater ferocity. They could hear the sound of tearing metal and breaking glass, indicating that the predator was making progress in its attempts to gain entry. John made a desperate decision. "I'm going for the emergency radio in the communications center. If I can get a distress signal out, rescue teams might be able to reach us before—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood what he meant. Their survival now depended on reaching help before the bear succeeded in breaching their defenses. The communications center was located in the opposite direction from the main entrance, which offered some protection from the bear's immediate assault. John moved carefully through the darkened corridors, using emergency lighting to navigate while trying to remain as quiet as possible. Behind him, Rachel and David huddled together in the hallway, listening to the terrible sounds of destruction as the bear systematically dismantled their shelter. The attacks were becoming more focused and effective, suggesting that the animal had identified the door frame as the building's primary weakness. John reached the communications center and immediately began powering up the emergency radio system. The equipment was designed to operate on backup power, but initialization would take several minutes, during which he would be completely exposed if the bear managed to get inside. As the radio systems came online, he could hear the bear's assault growing more intense. The sound of splintering wood and tearing metal echoed through the building, accompanied by the animal's deep, rumbling growls of effort and frustration. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Polar Research Station Alpha 7, he broadcast on the emergency frequency. "We have a polar bear attack in progress. 3 persons trapped. Immediate assistance required. Our position is—" The transmission was interrupted by a tremendous crash that shook the entire building. Through the communications center window, John could see that the bear had finally broken through the outer door frame and was now attacking the inner door that led directly into the station's main living area. "John!" Rachel's scream echoed through the hallway, filled with pure terror. The inner door lasted less than a minute under the bear's assault. 800 pounds of muscle, bone, and razor-sharp claws made short work of the residential-grade barrier, and suddenly the massive predator was inside the station. John abandoned the radio and ran toward his wife's voice, knowing that he was probably running toward his own death, but unable to abandon her and David to face the bear alone. As he rounded the corner into the main corridor, he came face to face with the most terrifying sight of his life. The polar bear filled the entire width of the hallway, its massive head nearly touching the ceiling. Its fur was matted with snow and ice, and its black eyes reflected the emergency lighting with an almost supernatural intensity. Blood stained its claws from its assault on the door, and its breath formed clouds of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. Rachel and David were pressed against the far wall, unable to retreat further and completely exposed to the predator's attention. The bear's focus was entirely on them, and it began moving forward with the slow, deliberate gait of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. John grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall mount and discharged it directly at the bear's face, hoping the chemical spray and noise would drive the animal back. The bear flinched and shook its head, but rather than retreating, it turned its attention toward this new threat. The predator's charge was swift and terrible. John had time for one final thought about Rachel before 800 pounds of polar bear slammed into him, driving him to the floor with crushing force. The animal's claws raked across his chest and arms, tearing through his heavy clothing and finding flesh beneath. Pain exploded through his body as the bear's teeth closed on his shoulder, the powerful jaws exerting pressure that he could feel crushing bone and muscle. He tried to scream, but the bear's weight on his chest made breathing impossible. Rachel's screams filled the hallway as she watched her husband being mauled by the massive predator. David grabbed her arm and tried to pull her away, but there was nowhere to go. The bear blocked their path to the exit, and the safe room remained sealed. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but to John it felt like an eternity of unimaginable agony. The bear's claws opened deep wounds across his torso, while its teeth found his neck and shoulder repeatedly. Blood spread across the floor beneath him, steaming in the cold air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack stopped. The bear lifted its head and looked toward Rachel and David, as if deciding which of them would be its next victim. John lay motionless beneath the massive animal, unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. David made a desperate attempt to distract the bear, throwing everything he could reach while shouting at the top of his lungs. A laptop computer struck the animal in the head, followed by a chair and several books. But the bear seemed more annoyed than intimidated by these projectiles. The predator stepped over John's motionless form and began stalking toward Rachel, who had backed against the wall and was staring at the approaching death with a combination of terror and resignation. Her scientific mind continued to function even in extremis, noting details about the bear's behavior and physical condition that she would never have the chance to document. The polar bear was less than 3 meters away when the building's backup power system finally activated, flooding the hallway with bright light and triggering a new round of alarm sounds. The sudden change startled the animal, causing it to pause and look around uncertainly. In that moment of hesitation, the emergency radio in the communications center crackled to life with an incoming transmission. Alpha 7, this is Resolute Bay Emergency Response. We received your Mayday call. Rescue helicopter is en route. ETA approximately 45 minutes. Please respond with status update. The sound of human voices from the radio seemed to capture the bear's attention, and it turned away from Rachel to investigate this new stimulus. The animal moved toward the communications center with obvious curiosity, leaving the two survivors momentarily unguarded. David immediately went to John's side, checking for signs of life while trying to assess the severity of his injuries. John was unconscious and losing blood rapidly from multiple lacerations, but he was still breathing. Without immediate medical attention, he would not survive long enough for rescue to arrive. "We have to get him to the medical supplies," David whispered to Rachel, who had joined them beside John's motionless form. "The emergency kit has blood-clotting agents and bandages." The medical supplies were stored in a cabinet near the safe room, which would require them to move past the area where the bear was currently investigating the radio equipment. They could hear the animal's claws clicking on the floor as it explored the communications center, occasionally bumping into equipment and causing electronic feedback. Working together, they managed to lift John's unconscious form and begin moving him slowly toward the medical supplies. Every step was agony, both because of John's weight and because they expected the bear to return at any moment. They had covered perhaps half the distance when the bear emerged from the communications center, its massive head swiveling as it searched for the humans it had been stalking. The predator's eyesight was excellent, and it spotted them immediately. This time, there was no hesitation. The bear charged directly toward them, its powerful legs driving it forward with terrifying speed. David pushed Rachel aside and tried to shield John's unconscious body, but there was nothing any of them could do to prevent what was about to happen. The impact knocked David across the hallway, where he struck the wall with enough force to leave him dazed and disoriented. The bear's attention focused immediately on John, who was completely helpless to defend himself. What followed was a scene of violence so brutal that Rachel's mind seemed to shut down, refusing to process what she was witnessing. The bear's attack on John's unconscious form was swift and methodical, driven by predatory instincts that had been honed by millions of years of evolution. When it was over, John Turner was beyond any human help. The polar bear stood over its victim, blood staining its muzzle and claws, before turning its attention to the two remaining humans. David was struggling to regain his feet, blood trickling from a head wound where he had struck the wall. His vision was blurred and his coordination severely compromised, making any attempt at escape or defense nearly impossible. Rachel remained frozen against the far wall, her mind unable to cope with the reality that her husband was dead and that she would almost certainly be next. The bear approached her slowly, as if savoring the final moments before completing its destruction of the human intruders. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance caused the bear to pause and lift its head, listening to the approaching aircraft with obvious attention. The rescue team was still several minutes away, but the noise was growing steadily louder. The bear seemed to understand that its time was limited. Rather than continuing to stalk Rachel, it turned and moved quickly toward the damaged entrance, apparently intending to flee before the helicopter arrived. But as it reached the doorway, the predator stopped and looked back at the two surviving humans. Its black eyes seemed to reflect a cold intelligence, as if it were memorizing their faces for some future encounter. Then, the massive polar bear disappeared into the Arctic wilderness, leaving behind a scene of destruction that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The rescue helicopter arrived 22 minutes later, its crew prepared for a routine evacuation, but completely unprepared for what they found inside the research station. The paramedics' first priority was treating David's head injury and checking Rachel for signs of shock or trauma. John's body was beyond help, but the medical team followed standard protocols for documenting the scene and preserving evidence for the investigation that would inevitably follow. The station's security cameras had recorded most of the attack, providing graphic documentation of the polar bear's assault. Rachel was evacuated to the hospital in Iqaluit, where she spent 3 weeks recovering from severe psychological trauma. David's physical injuries healed within a month, but the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. The official investigation concluded that the bear's attack was the result of a combination of factors: unusual weather patterns that had disrupted its normal hunting grounds, the extended period without food that had made it desperate, and the research station's location in an area of increased polar bear activity. The station itself was abandoned after the attack, deemed too dangerous for future research activities. The $2 million facility was left to the mercy of the Arctic elements, gradually being buried under snow and ice until only its radio antenna remained visible above the drifts. The massive polar bear was never found, despite extensive searches by wildlife authorities. Some believe it eventually died of starvation in the harsh Arctic wilderness, while others worry that it survived to threaten other human settlements in the region. Rachel Turner never returned to the Arctic. She left her career in climate research and now teaches environmental science at a university in southern Canada, where the closest thing to a polar bear is a polar bear is a stuffed animal in her office that she keeps as a reminder of the husband she lost to the White Death of the far north. The official death toll from the Polar Research Station Alpha 7 incident was 1 fatality, but those who knew the 3 researchers understood that the attack had claimed more than 1 life. The John Turner who had eagerly embarked on the research expedition had died in that frozen hallway, along with the optimistic scientists who had believed that human technology could protect them from the ancient dangers of the Arctic wilderness. In the end, the polar bear had done what polar bears have always done. It had hunted, killed, and survived in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The humans had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, intruders in a realm where they would never truly belong. The Arctic keeps its secrets, and the abandoned research station stands as a monument to humanity's hubris in believing that steel and concrete can provide protection from nature's most perfect predators. Somewhere in that vast white wilderness, the bear that destroyed 3 lives in less than 12 minutes continues its ancient struggle for survival, carrying with it the memory of the day when humans learned that they are not the apex predators they believed themselves to be.